Tom Halstead had been born in a cannery worker's cabin in Kenai in 1957, back when Alaska was still new to statehood, and the smell of salmon guts was as much a part of summer as mosquitoes and midnight sun. His father had worked the slime line for 32 years before black lung from all that fish meal dust had taken him at 58, and his mother had cleaned vacation rentals for the tourists who came up on cruise ships to play at being Alaskan for a week. Tom had learned the rivers the way some kids learned multiplication tables, spending every free hour with his grandfather, a Dena'ina man who knew where every salmon run would peak, where the bears fed, where the current would carry you to safety or drag you under. By the time Tom was 12, he could read water like a book, could tell you which pools would hold the biggest kings, which gravel bars were safe to wade, which overhanging branches meant a bear trail nearby. He'd put himself through community college working on fishing boats, then spent 20 years guiding sport fishermen before finally scraping together enough money to buy his own small operation. Alaska Premier fishing experiences wasn't much, just Tom and his beat-up aluminum drift boat and a website his daughter Sarah had built for him. But it was honest work, and it kept food on the table for his wife Marie and their 2 kids. That May morning in 2008 started like 1,000 others, with Tom's alarm going off at 4:30, and the automatic coffee maker gurgling to life in the dark kitchen of their small house on the edge of town. Marie stirred beside him but didn't wake, and Tom dressed quietly in the bathroom, pulling on the same Carhartt jacket he'd worn for 15 years, checking his pockets out of habit for his knife, his lighter, his small first aid kit. The house was mortgaged to the hilt, and the payment was always 2 weeks away from late, but it was theirs, 3,200 square feet of weathered siding and peeling paint, with a view of the inlet and a garage, where Tom kept his gear organized with the precision of a man who knew that chaos led to mistakes, and mistakes on the river led to death. He poured coffee into his dented thermos, grabbed the lunch Marie had packed the night before, and stood for a moment in the doorway of his daughter's old room, now serving as a home office where Marie did bookkeeping for 3 local businesses to help make ends meet. Sarah was finishing her senior year at UAF on a scholarship, the first Halstead to attend university, and Tom's son Michael was in Afghanistan on his 2nd deployment with the Marines, and Tom felt the weight of being 51 years old and still struggling while his children tried to build better lives, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. The drive to the Russian River was 40 minutes through darkness, the road winding past strip malls and gas stations that hadn't existed when Tom was young, past vacation homes that sold for $700,000 to people from California and Texas who came maybe 2 weeks a year. Tom's boat was waiting at the launch where he kept it, and he went through his morning routine with the muscle memory of decades, checking the life jackets, testing the motor, organizing his tackle box, filling the water jugs. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, turning that peculiar Alaska blue that existed nowhere else on Earth, and Tom could already see 3 other guides launching their boats, nodding to him in that taciturn way of men who make their living on the same water. There was Pete Kozlov, who'd been guiding even longer than Tom, and young Danny Terwilliger, trying to build a business while working construction on the side, and Frank Yazzie from the Yukon, who came down every summer and could spot a bear from a mile away. They were good men, careful men, who respected the resource and understood that salmon runs could be fragile things when you didn't pay attention to the science. Tom's clients that morning were a father and son from Ohio, the Mitchells, who'd booked a 3-day package and arrived with brand new Sims waders still creased from the packaging and expensive sage rods they clearly didn't know how to use. But they were polite and genuinely excited, asking questions and listening when Tom explained the life cycle of the sockeye, and he found himself enjoying their enthusiasm, even as he kept a careful eye on the water levels and the other boats and the ravens circling overhead that might indicate a bear kill upstream. They caught 7 fish by noon, the father whooping with joy when he landed a 12-pound bright female that fought like she meant it, and Tom showed the son how to properly release the hen they didn't keep, cradling her in the current until her gills pumped strong and she kicked away into the green depths. These were the moments Tom lived for, these small acts of stewardship, passing on knowledge to people who might never come back to Alaska, but who would remember that fishing could be something more than just killing for sport. But that afternoon, when Tom brought the Mitchells back to the launch and helped them load their gear into their rental SUV, he noticed something that made his jaw tighten. Across the parking area, 3 massive black Chevy Suburbans with tinted windows had pulled up, and men in expensive rain gear were unloading equipment with the careless confidence of people who'd never been told no in their lives. Tom recognized the logo on their jackets: Tidewater Resource Development, a Seattle-based company that had been buying up fishing lodges and land all over the peninsula for the past 2 years. The men were loud, laughing at jokes Tom couldn't hear, and they had the kind of deep tans that came from Caribbean vacations, not from working outdoors in Alaska. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a jaw like a sledgehammer, was barking orders into a satellite phone, and Tom watched as they launched 2 gleaming new willy boats, each probably worth more than Tom made in 3 years, loaded with gear that looked military grade. Tom's friend Frank wandered over as they both watched the Tidewater crews motor upriver, their powerful outboards leaving rooster tails that rocked the smaller boats at anchor. "They got permits for the North Fork," Frank said quietly, spitting into the gravel. "Some kind of resource assessment, is what I heard. Been going up there every day for a week, staying past dark." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. The North Fork was spawning ground, sacred water where the salmon came to complete their cycle, where the bears fed and the eagles nested, and the whole complicated machinery of life that made Alaska what it was played out in perfect balance. You didn't run assessment crews through spawning grounds during peak season unless you were either ignorant or didn't care, and men who worked for Tidewater Resource Development were definitely not ignorant. "Who issued the permits?" Tom asked, already knowing the answer. Frank shrugged. "State office in Anchorage, signed off by Pritchard." Daniel Pritchard was the regional director for Alaska Fish and Game, a political appointee who'd spent his career working for energy companies before somehow landing a position overseeing wildlife management. Tom had met him once at a community meeting, remembered the man's soft hands and his dismissive smile when local guides tried to raise concerns about development pressure on critical habitat. That evening, Tom sat at his kitchen table with Marie, picking at the halibut she'd baked with lemon and dill, and tried to explain the unease he felt. Marie listened the way she'd been listening for 30 years of marriage, with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and her eyes never leaving his face. And when he finished, she reached across the scarred oak table and squeezed his hand. "You've been guiding that river since before Sarah was born," she said. "If you think something's wrong, something's wrong." Marie Halstead had grown up in a fishing family too, had learned to read men and weather with equal skill, and Tom felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease just from having her believe him. But he also saw the worry in her eyes, the quick glance toward the stack of bills on the counter, the way her fingers tightened just slightly around her mug. They couldn't afford for Tom to make enemies of powerful companies, couldn't afford for him to lose clients or permits or access to the water. They were 2 months behind on Michael's college fund contributions that they'd promised to maintain while he was deployed, and Sarah needed money for textbooks next semester, and the boat motor was making a sound that suggested expensive repairs in the near future. Tom spent the next week paying close attention to the Tidewater crews, watching from a distance as they motored upriver every morning and came back at dusk. He noticed they were anchoring in places no competent guide would anchor, running their boats through shallow riffles where salmon were staging. And on Thursday, he saw something that made his blood run cold. He'd been working a client through a long pool below the falls when he noticed unusual turbidity in the water, a milky cloudiness that didn't belong. Tom beached his boat and walked upstream along the bank, following the discoloration to its source, and found fresh equipment marks on the gravel bar and what looked like core samples taken from the streambed itself. Holes drilled deep into the substrate and left open, sediment bleeding into the current. He took photos with his waterproof camera, noting the GPS coordinates in the small notebook he always carried, and when he got home that night, he spent 3 hours on the internet researching mineral rights and stream law and environmental regulations until his eyes burned and Marie finally coaxed him to bed. The pattern became clear over the following weeks, as Tom documented everything he saw with the careful attention of a man who understood that knowledge was the only weapon he possessed. The Tidewater crews were conducting mineral surveys, taking samples of gravel and bedrock, mapping the stream bed with equipment that Tom recognized from his father's stories of gold mining operations. But this was salmon spawning habitat, protected by federal and state law, and there was no legitimate reason for a resource development company to be conducting surveys, unless they were planning something that would require those protections to be removed or waived. Tom started asking questions, carefully, making phone calls to friends in the environmental community, reaching out to the biologists he knew from decades of working alongside fish and game. What he learned made him sick. Tidewater Resource Development was a subsidiary of a larger mining conglomerate, and they'd quietly acquired options on subsurface mineral rights for 40,000 acres of watershed throughout the Kenai Peninsula. The rights had been sold decades earlier when Alaska was desperate for revenue, back before anyone understood the real value of functioning ecosystems. And now, those rights were being activated. Tom tried to raise the alarm through proper channels, attending a Fish and Game Commission meeting in Soldotna, where he and a dozen other guides presented their concerns and their documentation. The commissioners listened with expressions ranging from bored to hostile, and Daniel Pritchard himself dismissed their evidence as anecdotal and based on misunderstanding of standard assessment protocols. When Tom pressed harder, asking why surveys were being conducted during peak spawning season when regulations clearly prohibited disruption of salmon habitat, Pritchard smiled his dismissive smile and suggested that perhaps Mr. Halstead should focus on guiding tourists and leave resource management to professionals who understood the complexities involved. The meeting ended with nothing changed, the permit still valid, and Tom walked out into the parking lot, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Frank caught up with him before he reached his truck, putting a weathered hand on Tom's shoulder. "They're not going to listen," Frank said quietly. "Too much money involved, but that doesn't mean we stop paying attention." The old guide's eyes were hard. "My grandfather told me that when you see wrong being done to the land, you have a duty to bear witness, even if you can't stop it. So we bear witness, Tom. We document everything, and we wait for the moment when someone with power might actually care." But the truth was that Tom wasn't good at waiting, wasn't built for passive observation when he could see destruction happening in real time. He started spending his off days on the river, not guiding, but watching, filling notebook after notebook with observations, dates, times, locations, descriptions of activities. He photographed the Tidewater crews and their equipment, documented the increasing turbidity in the water downstream of their work sites, noted the first reports from other guides of salmon behaving strangely, holding in pools where they shouldn't hold, refusing to move upstream into spawning grounds. He collected water samples in clean jars and paid out of his own pocket to have them tested at a lab in Anchorage, and when the results came back showing elevated levels of heavy metals and sediment load, he submitted copies to every state and federal agency he could find an address for. Most of his letters went unanswered, and the few responses he received were form letters thanking him for his input and assuring him that all permitted activities were conducted within strict regulatory guidelines. Tom's obsession with documenting the Tidewater operation began to affect his business, clients noticing his distraction, his tendency to beach the boat and wait upstream to check on something he'd seen. His reviews on TripAdvisor started to slip, people mentioning that their guide seemed more interested in taking pictures of other boats than in helping them catch fish, and Tom watched his booking rate for the next season drop by 30%. Marie didn't say anything, but he saw her doing the math, saw her taking on a fourth bookkeeping client, saw her checking their savings account balance more frequently. Sarah called from Fairbanks one evening, and Tom could hear the worry in her voice when she asked if everything was okay at home, if they were having money trouble, if she should maybe look for a part-time job to help with expenses. Tom told her to focus on her studies, told her everything was fine, and hated himself for lying, but didn't know what else to say. How did you explain to your daughter that you were choosing the health of a river over the stability of your family, that you couldn't stop yourself from fighting even when the fight was destroying you? In July, Tom got a visit from a state trooper named Miller, who arrived at his house on a Wednesday afternoon and asked to speak with him privately. They sat on Tom's back deck overlooking the inlet, and Miller, a man about Tom's age with kind eyes and a careful way of speaking, said he'd received complaints that Tom had been harassing Tidewater Resource Development employees, taking unauthorized photographs, and interfering with permitted commercial activities. Tom felt his face flush with anger, but forced himself to stay calm, to respond with the same careful precision he used when navigating dangerous water. He explained what he'd observed, showed Miller his documentation, walked him through the timeline of regulatory violations and unanswered complaints. Miller listened, really listened, and when Tom finished, the trooper was quiet for a long moment, watching an eagle circle over the water. "I believe you," Miller finally said, "but belief doesn't mean much when the people writing the checks have lawyers and connections in Juneau. You need to be careful, Tom. These aren't small-time operators you're dealing with. Tidewater is owned by Cascade Holdings, which is owned by the Remington Group, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the Pacific Northwest. They have politicians on speed dial, and they don't like people who make trouble." Tom asked what Miller suggested he do, whether there was anyone in law enforcement who would actually investigate, and the trooper's expression was sympathetic but resigned. "Keep documenting," Miller said. "Build your case, but watch your back, because these people play hardball, and they have resources you can't imagine." That conversation should have scared Tom off, should have convinced him to step back and protect his family and his business. Instead, it made him more determined, more careful, more methodical in his approach. He started organizing his documentation into something coherent, creating a master timeline with photos and water test results, and witness statements from other guides who'd observed the same things he had. He learned about the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Water Act, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, teaching himself the language of environmental law late into the night while Marie slept. He reached out to conservation groups, sending his documentation to the Alaska Center for the Environment and the Wild Salmon Center and Trout Unlimited. And slowly, he started to find allies. A young lawyer named Rebecca Chen from the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Alaska expressed interest in his case, suggesting that there might be grounds for a citizen suit under the Clean Water Act if they could establish that permitted activities were violating water quality standards. The possibility of legal action, of actually forcing someone to pay attention, gave Tom a surge of hope that carried him through the rest of summer and into fall when the tourists left and the rivers ran clear and cold under shortening days. But as Tom would learn in the coming months, hope could be a dangerous thing when you were up against people who viewed the natural world as nothing more than assets to be extracted and obstacles to be eliminated. The real escalation was about to begin, and the predators moving into position weren't brown bears defending their territory, but men in boardrooms who decided that Tom Halstead and his documentation had become a problem that needed to be solved. The machinery of corruption that would nearly kill him was already grinding into motion, gears meshing in offices and bars and back rooms where deals were made, and consequences for ordinary people were calculated as acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit. But on that October evening, as Tom sat at his kitchen table, organizing his notebooks, and feeling like maybe, just maybe, he was building something that mattered, he allowed himself to believe that truth and evidence and determination might be enough. He didn't yet understand that the men he was fighting had long ago decided that Alaska's wild places were worth more dead than alive, and that they would do whatever it took to keep people like Tom Halstead from interfering with that vision. The antagonists in Tom's story didn't announce themselves with obvious villainy or cartoonish evil. They arrived in expensive suits and confident smiles in the form of a man named Bradford Remington III, who flew into Kenai on a private jet in early November and held a community meeting at the Aspen Hotel to present Tidewater Resource Development's vision for responsible resource extraction on the Kenai Peninsula. Tom attended the meeting, along with maybe 70 other locals, watching from the back row as Remington worked the room with practiced ease, his silver hair perfectly styled, his teeth impossibly white, his handshake firm and his eye contact unwavering as he greeted the mayor and the city council members and the local business owners who'd been specifically invited. Remington was maybe 55, with the kind of ageless appearance that came from personal trainers and dermatologists, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Tom's truck, and when he took the stage, his voice had that smooth authority of a man who'd never been told he was wrong. He spoke about economic opportunity and job creation and responsible development, about how Tidewater's mineral surveys had identified significant rare earth deposits in the region that could bring millions in revenue to local communities while being extracted using state-of-the-art environmental protections that would ensure zero impact on fisheries or wildlife. The presentation included slick graphics and testimonials from other communities that had supposedly thrived from similar projects, and Tom watched with growing fury as the audience nodded along, as people who should have known better started to see dollar signs instead of salmon. When the question period came, Tom raised his hand, and when Remington called on him with that practiced smile, Tom stood and began laying out his evidence, describing the core sampling he'd witnessed, and the water quality degradation, and the behavioral changes in the salmon runs. He spoke for maybe 3 minutes, aware of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, aware of Remington's smile never wavering. And when he finished, the room was silent for a beat before Remington responded. "I appreciate your passion, Mr. Halstead, is it, Tom?" The use of his first name was calculated to seem friendly while actually being dismissive. "But I think what you're describing is a fundamental misunderstanding of modern resource extraction techniques. The exploratory work you observed was conducted under strict permit guidelines with full oversight from state environmental agencies. I understand that change can be concerning, especially for folks who've made their living off the old ways of doing things. But progress requires us to look beyond nostalgia and embrace the economic realities of the 21st century." The response generated applause from several people in the audience, and Tom felt his face burn as Remington smoothly moved on to the next question, effectively dismissing Tom's concerns as the complaints of someone too backward to understand progress. After the meeting, several people Tom had known for years avoided making eye contact with him, and he overheard one city council member saying to another that maybe it was time for some of the old-timers to retire and let younger people with fresh perspectives take over. But more concerning than the public dismissal was what happened 3 days later when Tom received a certified letter from a law firm in Seattle informing him that he was being sued for defamation and tortious interference with business relations. The suit alleged that Tom had made false and damaging statements about Tidewater resource development, had harassed their employees, and had attempted to damage their business relationships through a campaign of misinformation. The damages being sought were $2 million. Tom read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking before he could even begin to process what it meant. They were trying to financially destroy him, to make an example of him that would terrify anyone else who might consider speaking up. Marie found him sitting at the kitchen table an hour later. The letter spread in front of him, and when she read it, her face went pale. "We'll fight this," she said, her voice steady, even though Tom could see the fear in her eyes. "They're trying to scare you. They can't actually win a defamation case when you're just reporting what you observed." But they both knew that winning or losing wasn't the point. The point was the legal fees, the stress, the years of litigation that would drain them dry, even if Tom ultimately prevailed. This was how powerful people crushed opposition, not by proving they were right, but by making the cost of resistance too high to bear. Tom called Rebecca Chen, the young environmental lawyer who'd expressed interest in his documentation, and she listened with mounting concern as he described the lawsuit. "This is a SLAPP suit," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're designed to silence critics through legal intimidation. Alaska has anti-SLAPP statutes that might allow us to get this dismissed quickly, but you'll need legal representation, and environmental law firms that could help you typically don't handle defamation defense." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let me make some calls. There are lawyers who handle these cases pro bono because they understand the chilling effect this kind of litigation has on environmental advocacy. Don't do anything until you hear from me." Tom thanked her and hung up, and for the first time since he'd started documenting the Tidewater operation, he felt the full weight of what he'd gotten himself into. He thought about backing down, about issuing a public apology and retracting his concerns, about protecting his family and his home and his future. But then he thought about the salmon he'd watched struggling to spawn in turbid water, about the gravel bars torn up by core sampling equipment, about the future Sarah and Michael would inherit if people like Bradford Remington III were allowed to turn Alaska's wild places into strip mines. He thought about his grandfather teaching him to read the river, about the responsibility that came with knowing things others didn't know, and he realized he'd already made his choice months ago. He was going to fight, regardless of the cost, because surrender wasn't something he knew how to do. Over the next 2 months, Tom watched as the Tidewater operation expanded its reach. The company leasing additional lodge properties and hiring local contractors for construction work, and generally spreading money around the community in ways that bought goodwill and silence. A new hunting lodge went up near the Russian River, marketed to wealthy clients from the lower 48 who wanted an authentic Alaska experience. which apparently meant luxury accommodations and guided hunts where success was guaranteed. The lodge employed 20 people and brought revenue to local businesses, and Tom could feel the community's mood shifting. People who'd once been sympathetic to his concerns now viewing him as an obstacle to prosperity. His own client bookings for the next season had dropped another 20%, and he'd been forced to take a winter job at the marine supply store in town just to make ends meet. The job paid $12 an hour and left him smelling like motor oil and feeling like a failure, but it was money, and Marie didn't complain, and they made it work the way they'd always made things work. Then in January, Daniel Pritchard announced his retirement from Fish and Game, and 3 weeks later, it was revealed that he'd accepted a position as Senior Vice President for Environmental Compliance at Tidewater Resource Development. The news hit the local environmental community like a bomb, the corruption so blatant it should have triggered investigations and outrage. But instead, it was treated as just another career move, Pritchard's expertise in regulatory affairs being valuable to the private sector. Tom attended a protest at the Fish and Game office in Soldotna, maybe 40 people holding signs in the snow, while cars drove past and honked in support or derision in roughly equal measure. A reporter from the Peninsula Clarion took his picture and quoted him saying that this was exactly the kind of revolving door corruption that allows companies to destroy public resources for private profit. And the quote ran in the next day's paper, alongside a response from Tidewater's public relations director, noting that Mr. Halstead was currently the subject of litigation for making false statements about the company, and suggesting that readers take his claims with appropriate skepticism. Tom's phone rang that evening, an unknown number, and when he answered, a male voice told him calmly that he should be careful about continuing to defame Tidewater in the press, that the next lawsuit would be for criminal harassment, and that accidents happened to people who didn't know when to shut their mouths. The call lasted maybe 30 seconds before the line went dead, and Tom stood in his kitchen with his heart hammering, aware that he'd just been threatened, and aware that there was no way to prove it or do anything about it. Tom reported the call to Trooper Miller, who took a statement and said he'd look into it but didn't sound hopeful. "Document everything," Miller advised. "Record your phone calls if you can, install security cameras, and for God's sake, watch your back when you're out on the river alone." Tom followed the advice, spending money he didn't have on a simple security system, and starting to carry a canister of bear spray whenever he left the house. Feeling paranoid and violated and angry at having to live this way, Marie wanted him to drop the whole thing, to settle the lawsuit and move on. And they had their first real fight in years, voices raised in the kitchen at midnight, with both of them saying things they didn't mean, until finally they'd collapsed into exhausted silence, and Tom had promised to think about what she was asking. But thinking about it only reinforced his determination, because giving up meant letting Remington and Pritchard and all the other corrupt bastards win, meant teaching Sarah and Michael that power trumped truth, and that ordinary people should just accept whatever the wealthy decided to do to them and their home. The legal defense help Rebecca Chen had promised materialized in late February in the form of a Seattle attorney named James Kwan, who specialized in defending environmental advocates against slap suits. Kwan was maybe 40, intense and brilliant, and he took one look at the Tidewater lawsuit and laughed. "This is the sloppiest legal intimidation I've seen in years," he said over the phone, his voice crackling with energy. "They're alleging defamation, but your statements are all factual observations with documentation, and they're claiming tortious interference when you have a clear First Amendment right to petition for regulatory enforcement. We're going to file an anti-slap motion and get this thing dismissed, and if we're lucky, we'll get attorney's fees awarded against them for filing a frivolous suit." The confidence in Kwan's voice was like oxygen, and Tom felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time in months. But Kwan also warned him that the motion wouldn't be heard for several weeks, and that in the meantime, Tom needed to be extra careful because companies that filed slap suits often escalated to other forms of harassment when the legal intimidation wasn't working fast enough. March brought signs of spring, the snow melting in town even while the high country stayed white, and Tom started preparing his equipment for the upcoming season with mechanical efficiency that masked his dread. His bookings were down 60% from the previous year, several longtime clients explicitly canceling because they'd heard Tom was involved in some kind of environmental extremism, and they didn't want to support that kind of thing. The marina where Tom docked his boat informed him that they were raising slip fees by 40% due to increased operating costs, and when Tom questioned the timing, he was told flatly that the new rates applied to everyone equally, but he noticed that guides who worked for Tidewater-affiliated lodges seemed to be getting grandfather clauses that exempted them from the increase. The pressure was constant and multifaceted, designed to crush him economically and socially, to isolate him from the community until he had no choice but to surrender. Tom watched his savings account drain to nothing, watched Marie working herself to exhaustion to keep them afloat, watched Sarah worrying about them during phone calls when she should have been focused on her last semester of college, and he hated himself for putting them through this even as he couldn't bring himself to stop. In early April, Tom was guiding a pair of doctors from Pennsylvania, his first clients of the season, when he noticed unusual activity at the mouth of the Russian River. Heavy equipment had been brought in, a drill rig and excavators, and men in hard hats were working under bright lights, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. Tom beached his boat and walked over to investigate, his clients following curiously, and he found a work crew setting up for what looked like major construction. A foreman with a clipboard and a hostile expression told Tom this was a permitted work site, and he needed to clear the area, but Tom stood his ground and demanded to see the permits. The exchange escalated, voices rising, and Tom was aware of his clients looking uncomfortable, aware that he was probably ruining their expensive Alaska vacation with his obsessive focus on what they no doubt viewed as local politics. Eventually, a sheriff's deputy arrived and informed Tom that he was interfering with legitimate commercial activity and needed to leave or face arrest for trespassing. Tom left, took his clients fishing, pretended everything was fine, and got mediocre reviews afterward, noting that while the fishing was okay, their guide had been distracted by some kind of dispute with local workers and hadn't been fully present. But Tom did obtain copies of the permits later that week, and what he found made his blood run cold. Tidewater Resource Development had been granted approval for exploratory mining operations, with work to begin immediately on test excavations that would tear up salmon-spawning habitat along a 2-mile stretch of river. The permits had been issued by the newly appointed acting director of the Fish and Game Regional Office, a former state legislator named Cynthia Voss, who'd previously worked as a lobbyist for extractive industry companies. The public comment period had been exactly the legal minimum, 10 days, with notice published in newspapers during the first week of March, when most people were still focused on getting through winter and not reading the legal notices section. Tom's hands shook as he read through the technical language that essentially gutted every environmental protection that should have prevented this exact scenario. He immediately contacted Rebecca Chen and James Kwan, forwarding the permits and asking how this could possibly be legal, and their responses confirmed his worst fears. The permits were legal, barely, navigating loopholes and exploiting regulatory language with the precision of lawyers who'd spent years learning exactly how much they could get away with. The only option was an emergency injunction, which would require going before a federal judge and demonstrating immediate irreparable harm, and even that was a long shot given the deference courts typically gave to state resource management decisions. The escalation Tom had feared was manifesting not as overt violence, but as systematic elimination of every avenue of resistance, every tool that citizens theoretically possess to protect their interests against corporate power. He felt trapped in a nightmare where all the rules and procedures he'd been taught to believe in as a kid turned out to be theater, empty rituals that the powerful could manipulate at will while men like him shouted into the void. But he also felt rage, pure and clarifying. And rage could be fuel if you learned to harness it properly. Tom started attending every public meeting, every planning commission session, every opportunity for comment, and he brought his documentation and his photos and his water test results. And he forced people to look at the evidence, even when they didn't want to. He wrote letters to every newspaper in the state and op-eds for the Anchorage Daily News, and he accepted every interview request from environmental podcasts and activist groups. He became known as that crazy fishing guide who was obsessed with Tidewater, and he leaned into the label because being dismissed as crazy was better than being ignored entirely. In June, Tom got a break. A young biologist with fish and game named Dr. Lisa Park reached out to him privately, sending an encrypted email to an address Rebecca Chen had set up for secure communications. Dr. Park had been part of the team reviewing the tidewater permits, and she'd raised concerns about the potential impact on salmon populations, concerns that had been overruled by Acting Director Voss. Dr. Park was risking her career by sharing internal documents with Tom, but she believed the science was being deliberately ignored in favor of political expediency, and she wanted someone outside the system to have evidence of the process irregularities and data manipulation that had characterized the permit review. Tom met with Dr. Park at a coffee shop in Homer, sitting in the back corner while she nervously passed him a flash drive containing hundreds of pages of internal emails and review documents and scientific analyses that had been suppressed. "They're going to destroy the watershed," Dr. Park said quietly, her voice shaking. "The test excavations are just the beginning. If they find commercially viable deposits, which they will because they already know what's down there, they'll apply for full mining permits, and then it's over. 20,000 years of salmon evolution erased, so some billionaire can add another zero to his net worth." She looked at Tom with exhausted eyes. "I have student loans and aging parents, and I can't afford to lose my job by going public, but you're already fighting. Maybe you can do something with this that I can't." Tom took the flash drive home and spent the next week going through every document, and what he found was worse than he'd imagined. The internal emails showed Acting Director Voss explicitly overriding staff biologist recommendations, showed her coordinating with Tidewater lobbyists on permit language, showed her scheduling approvals to avoid maximum public scrutiny. The scientific analyses demonstrated with crystal clarity that the proposed mining operations would devastate salmon runs, increase heavy metal contamination in the watershed, and permanently damage habitat that supported not just fish, but the entire ecosystem, including brown bears, eagles, and the commercial fishing industry that thousands of Alaskans depended on for their livelihoods. Tom had been right about everything he documented, and now he had proof that state officials were actively conspiring to ignore their own scientists in order to serve corporate interests. He forwarded everything to James Kwan and Rebecca Chen, and within 48 hours, they'd filed an emergency motion for preliminary injunction in federal court, with Tom as the lead plaintiff, along with 3 other fishing guides who'd agreed to join the suit despite the risks. But Tom's moment of triumph was short-lived, because the forces he was fighting had resources and reach that extended far beyond anything he'd anticipated. 3 days after filing the injunction motion, Tom's boat motor was sabotaged at the marina, sugar poured into the fuel tank, requiring a complete engine rebuild that would cost $8,000 and take weeks to complete at the height of the season. The marina's security cameras had mysteriously been offline that night, and there were no witnesses and no evidence beyond the ruined motor. Tom filed a police report, and everyone knew it was connected to his activism, but nobody could prove anything, and Tom was left scrambling to rent a motor so he could fulfill his remaining client commitments. The next week, someone broke into Tom's truck while he was guiding clients, stealing his documentation notebooks and camera. And when Tom reported this theft, he saw the deputy's expression and realized the message was clear. "You're not protected, you're vulnerable, and we can hurt you anytime we want." Marie started sleeping poorly, waking at every sound, and Tom came home one afternoon to find her crying at the kitchen table after another anonymous phone call, this one threatening to hurt Sarah at school if Tom didn't drop his lawsuit and shut his mouth. That was the line crossed too far, the moment when Tom understood that these people would destroy anything and anyone to protect their interests. He sent Sarah home from Fairbanks early, had her move back into her old room where he could keep her safe, and he bought a shotgun that he'd never owned before because his grandfather had taught him that guns on rivers led to bad decisions. He installed motion sensor lights around the house and started sleeping in shifts with the shotgun beside the bed. And he watched his family living in fear because of his choices, and he wanted to scream and break things and make the men responsible feel even a fraction of the terror they'd inflicted on people who'd done nothing but try to protect a river. The federal court hearing on the injunction motion was scheduled for late August, and Tom and his co-plaintiffs spent the summer building their case with help from Rebecca Chen and James Kwan, and a growing network of environmental advocates who recognized that the fight over the Kenai Peninsula represented something larger than local interests. If Tidewater succeeded here, it would set precedent for mining operations throughout Alaska. demonstrating that corporate power could override environmental law whenever the financial stakes were high enough. Tom's story started appearing in national environmental publications, his face on the cover of Sierra magazine under the headline, "The Fisherman versus the Mining Giant," and the attention brought both support and backlash. Donations poured in from people around the country who wanted to help fund the legal fight, and Tom was able to replace his sabotaged motor and pay down some of their accumulated debt. But the attention also brought uglier responses, death threats in Tom's email, and social media harassment of Marie and Sarah, and Tom felt his world shrinking to a constant calculation of risk and threat assessment. Through all of this, Tom kept guiding, kept taking clients on the river, kept trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, even as everything fell apart around him. And it was during one of these normal days, September 1st of 2009, with the air crisp and the aspens turning gold, that Tom took a wealthy sport angler named Jeffrey Cardwell onto the Russian River for a late-season silver salmon run. Cardwell was a surgeon from Boston, fit and competent, and they'd had a good morning, taking 3 nice fish from the pool below the rapids. Tom beached the boat to let Cardwell work a promising stretch of bank, and he was standing in thigh-deep water, showing his client how to mend his line when he smelled it, that musky wild smell that meant brown bear very close. Tom's head snapped up and he saw her maybe 30 yards downstream, a massive sow with 2 cubs, fishing the same waters they were fishing, and Tom immediately started backing toward the boat while quietly telling Cardwell to move slowly and stay calm. Brown bears with cubs were the most dangerous animals in Alaska, fiercely protective and prone to attacking anything perceived as a threat. And Tom had his hand on his bear spray while keeping his eyes on the sow and calculating angles of retreat. But what happened next wasn't the bear's fault, wasn't nature being cruel or random. What happened was the direct result of months of disturbance and habitat destruction, and human activity in areas that should have been left alone. The test mining operations upriver had displaced bears from their traditional fishing grounds, pushing them into areas with more human traffic, and the sow was stressed and hungry, and trying to feed her cubs in unfamiliar territory. When she saw Tom and Cardwell in the water, saw 2 humans between her and her retreat route, her exhausted brain made the calculation that humans meant threat, and she needed to eliminate that threat to protect her babies. She came fast, faster than anything that large should be able to move, crashing through the shallows with water exploding around her massive body. And Tom shoved Cardwell toward the boat and planted his feet and pulled his bear spray, but she was on him before he could deploy it. 800 pounds of muscle and fur and desperation. Tom saw her eyes, saw the fear in them that mirrored his own, and then her paw hit him like a truck and he was underwater, tumbling, and when he came up, she had his arm in her jaws, and the pain was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. And somewhere far away, he could hear Cardwell screaming and the rapids roaring, and his own voice making sounds that weren't words. Jeffrey Cardwell saved Tom's life. The surgeon dropped his expensive fly rod and grabbed an oar from the boat and hit the bear across her face, hard, again and again, shouting and making himself large, and finally the sow released Tom's arm and backed away, confused by this aggressive response, shepherding her cubs toward the far bank and disappearing into the alders. Cardwell dragged Tom out of the water and applied a tourniquet with his belt, and called for emergency services on his satellite phone, while Tom looked at his arm, at the white of bone showing through torn flesh, and the blood that seemed impossible in its volume, and thought with strange clarity that he was going to die on this river he'd spent his whole life trying to protect. Cardwell kept talking to him, keeping him conscious, and Tom remembers fragments: the sound of a helicopter, the EMTs loading him onto a stretcher, Marie's face white with terror at the hospital, and later, much later, a doctor telling him they'd done everything they could, but the damage was too extensive, and they'd had to amputate below the elbow. Tom looked at the bandaged stump where his right arm used to be and felt a grief so profound it had no name, grief not just for the limb, but for everything it represented, for the life he'd known, and the work he'd done, and the future he'd imagined. But lying in that hospital bed with morphine fog clouding his thoughts, Tom also felt something else beneath the grief, a cold clarity that cut through every other emotion, The bear attack hadn't been bad luck or random chance. It was the logical consequence of the destruction he'd been fighting against. The price extracted from the natural world, when humans decided that short-term profit mattered more than long-term sustainability. That sow should have been fishing traditional grounds 2 miles upstream, grounds that were now being torn apart by test mining equipment. Those cubs should have been safe in habitat that hadn't been disrupted by human activity. The attack was another entry in Tom's documentation, another piece of evidence, and even through the pain and loss, he found himself thinking about how to use it, how to make people understand the real cost of what Bradford Remington III and his company were doing to Alaska. The realization frightened him, this ability to calculate and strategize even in his darkest moment, but it also steeled him for what came next. Because if Tom Halstead had learned anything in 52 years of life, it was that you didn't quit in the middle of the river. You got back in the boat and you kept going, or you drowned. And Tom wasn't ready to drown. The hospital room where Tom spent the next 2 weeks became an unexpected command center for the legal fight against Tidewater Resource Development. Rebecca Chen visited daily, bringing her laptop and case files, and they worked through pain medication fog and physical therapy sessions to build the narrative they would present in federal court. The bear attack had drawn media attention in ways Tom's activism never had. News crews from Anchorage and even Seattle showing up to interview the fisherman who'd lost his arm protecting salmon habitat. Tom was careful in these interviews, always connecting his injury back to the larger story of habitat destruction and regulatory corruption, and he watched public opinion begin to shift as people saw the human cost of environmental degradation. Bradford Remington III issued a statement expressing sympathy for Mr. Halstead's unfortunate accident, while noting that brown bear attacks were a natural risk in Alaska and had nothing to do with Tidewater's carefully regulated operations. But the statement came across as callous and dismissive, and the company's public relations problem grew worse when environmental groups circulated Dr. Park's leaked documents, showing that Tidewater's own environmental impact assessments had predicted increased bear-human conflicts as a result of habitat displacement. Tom had also gained an unexpected ally in Jeffrey Cardwell, whose surgical skills and quick action had saved Tom's life. Cardwell was appalled when he learned the context of the attack, and as a respected physician and member of Boston's medical establishment, his voice carried weight that Tom's never could. Cardwell wrote a detailed account of the incident for the New England Journal of Medicine, framing it as a public health case study on the downstream effects of environmental policy, and the article generated significant discussion in medical and policy circles. Cardwell also testified via video deposition for Tom's lawsuit, describing the bear's behavior as consistent with stress responses in animals displaced from their territory, and his expert testimony was devastating to Tidewater's narrative that mining operations had no impact on wildlife behavior. Tom watched the deposition from his hospital bed, his phantom arm aching with pain that would never fully go away, and felt grateful in ways he'd never expected for the courage of a man he barely knew. The preliminary injunction hearing took place in early October, and Tom attended via video conference from his home in Soldotna, still recovering from surgery and learning to navigate the world with one arm. James Kwan presented a methodical case built on Tom's documentation, Dr. Park's leaked emails, water quality data, and the testimony of multiple expert witnesses who explained the ecological cascade that resulted from stream habitat disruption. The judge was a woman named Maria Rodriguez, appointed by a Democratic president 15 years earlier, known for her careful attention to environmental law, and Tom watched her face as Kwan laid out the evidence of regulatory malfeasance and corporate misconduct. Tidewater's attorneys argued that the permit process had followed all legal requirements, that their operations met or exceeded environmental standards, and that any concerns about salmon populations or bear behavior were speculative and unsupported by the weight of evidence. They were smooth and confident and used technical language to obscure simple truths, but Tom could see that Judge Rodriguez wasn't buying it. She asked pointed questions about the timing of permit approvals, about the suppression of internal scientific assessments, about the relationship between Acting Director Voss and Tidewater lobbyists, and the company's attorneys grew increasingly defensive. The ruling came 2 weeks later, and it was everything Tom and his co-plaintiffs had hoped for. Judge Rodriguez granted the preliminary injunction, halting all tidewater mining operations pending a full environmental impact review conducted by an independent third party. Her written opinion was scathing, noting that the permit approval process appears to have been corrupted by inappropriate ex parte communications between regulators and industry representatives, and that the evidence suggests systematic circumvention of environmental protections designed to prevent exactly the kind of habitat destruction at issue here. The judge also noted Tom's bear attack, writing that, while causation in wilderness incidents is complex, the court finds the plaintiff's contention that habitat displacement contributed to the attack plausible and supported by expert testimony. The ruling made national news, framed as a David versus Goliath story about a one-armed fisherman taking down a mining giant, and Tom did interview after interview from his living room, always careful to credit his allies and to emphasize that this was about protecting public resources for future generations. But while the injunction was a victory, it wasn't the end of the story. Tidewater immediately appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and the company launched a public relations campaign framing themselves as victims of environmental extremism and judicial overreach. Bradford Remington III appeared on Alaska Public Television, arguing that the ruling would kill jobs and economic development, and several state legislators introduced bills that would have weakened salmon habitat protections in response to overzealous federal interference. Tom watched these maneuvers with grim recognition, understanding that powerful interests didn't accept defeat gracefully, and that the legal battle could continue for years, draining resources and political will. But Tom also saw new allies emerging: commercial fishermen whose livelihoods depended on healthy salmon runs joining environmental advocates to fight the legislative proposals, and tribal councils asserting their treaty rights to protect traditional fishing grounds. The coalition that formed around the Tidewater fight was broad and diverse, and motivated by the recognition that if corporate mining interests could override protections in Alaska, nowhere was safe. The real reckoning came in December when the Alaska Department of Law announced an investigation into Acting Director Cynthia Voss and her role in the permit approval process. The investigation had been triggered by the federal judge's ruling and the leaked documents Dr. Park had provided, and it quickly expanded to include multiple fish and game officials and their communications with Tidewater. Tom watched the news coverage with satisfaction as Voss was placed on administrative leave and subpoenas were issued for company executives, including Bradford Remington III himself. The investigation revealed a pattern of corruption that extended beyond the Tidewater permits, showing that Voss had systematically fast-tracked approvals for extractive industry projects while suppressing scientific concerns, always in close coordination with company lobbyists, and often followed by job offers or consulting contracts. The scandal grew to encompass the governor's office when emails surfaced showing that senior administration officials had pressured Fish and Game to accommodate Tidewater's timeline for permit approvals. And suddenly, Tom's story about salmon and bears became a story about corruption at the highest levels of state government. Daniel Pritchard, the former Fish and Game director who'd taken the vice president position at Tidewater, was called to testify before a state legislative committee, and Tom attended the hearing in person, sitting in the front row with his empty sleeve pinned up and his remaining hand folded on the table in front of him. He watched Pritchard squirm and dissemble and deflect responsibility, claiming he'd retired from state service before accepting the Tidewater position, and that any allegations of coordination were false and politically motivated. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming, showing Pritchard had been negotiating his Tidewater employment while still serving as director, had participated in strategy sessions about how to streamline permit approvals, and had shared confidential regulatory information with company executives. The committee chairman, a conservative Republican from Juneau, who'd initially been sympathetic to Tidewater's development agenda, looked disgusted as he reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Pritchard, you betrayed the public trust," the chairman said quietly. "You sold out Alaska's resources for a paycheck. I hope it was worth it." Pritchard had no answer, and 3 days later, he resigned from Tidewater under a cloud of scandal that ended his career in both public and private sectors. Cynthia Voss fared worse. The investigation revealed she'd accepted nearly $200,000 in consulting fees from various industry groups while serving as acting director, payments that had been carefully structured to avoid disclosure requirements, but that clearly represented payment for regulatory favors. The Alaska Attorney General brought charges of conflict of interest, bribery, and official misconduct, and Voss was arrested in a dawn raid that made for spectacular television coverage. Tom watched her perp walk on the news, this woman who'd sold out salmon runs and bear habitat for money she didn't even need, and felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. These were human beings, not monsters, people who'd made choices that prioritized their own interests over their responsibilities, and the damage they'd caused would echo through ecosystems for generations. But they were being held accountable, which meant the system could still work when enough people refused to accept corruption as normal. Bradford Remington III never faced criminal charges, insulated by layers of corporate structure and plausible deniability, but the scandal destroyed Tidewater Resource Development's reputation and its ability to operate in Alaska. The company's board of directors fired Remington and settled the various lawsuits against them, agreeing to abandon all mining claims on the Kenai Peninsula and to fund a $20 million habitat restoration project overseen by independent scientists. The settlement was less than Tom wanted, but more than he'd thought possible, and it established precedent that would make similar projects harder to pursue throughout the state. Remington himself disappeared from public life, his name becoming synonymous with corporate greed and environmental destruction, and Tom allowed himself a moment of satisfaction knowing that the man who dismissed his concerns as nostalgia had been brought down by the very evidence Remington had insisted didn't matter. Through all of this, Tom was learning to live with one arm, to tie knots one-handed, and to operate a boat with adaptive equipment, and to accept help when he needed it. The physical therapy was grueling, and the phantom pain was worse, nights when he'd wake reaching for the arm that wasn't there. But Tom approached his rehabilitation with the same stubborn determination he'd brought to the Tidewater fight. He couldn't guide anymore, not safely, not with the physical demands of managing clients and boats on fast water. That loss hurt worse than the arm in some ways, severing his connection to work he'd defined himself by for 30 years. But Jeffrey Cardwell, the surgeon who'd saved Tom's life, helped arrange a position for Tom as a consultant with Alaska Fish and Game, advising on habitat protection and working with the new director to reform permitting processes. The job paid better than guiding ever had, and didn't destroy Tom's body. And while it felt strange to work in an office instead of on the river, Tom discovered he was good at translating scientific data into policy recommendations, and at building coalitions between different stakeholder groups. Marie had stood by Tom through everything, her strength and faith never wavering, even when he'd given her every reason to walk away. And Tom made a promise to himself and to her that he would spend the rest of his life being worthy of that loyalty. They paid off their debts with the settlement money and Tom's new salary, put money back into Sarah's college fund, started planning for a future that didn't involve constant crisis and fear. Sarah graduated from UAF with honors and got into graduate school for environmental science, her father's fight having inspired her own commitment to conservation work. Michael came home from Afghanistan, whole and relatively unscathed, and enrolled in community college on the GI Bill. And Tom sat with both his kids at the kitchen table one evening and felt overwhelming gratitude that despite everything, they were all still here, still together, still fighting for things that mattered. The redemption arc Tom needed came from an unexpected source. Frank Yazzie, his old friend from the river, reached out one spring evening with a proposal. Frank had been quietly building relationships with younger guides who'd worked for Tidewater-affiliated lodges during the scandal. Guys who'd taken the money because they needed to feed their families, but who'd been horrified when they learned what the company was really doing. Frank thought these guides deserved a chance to make amends, to be part of the solution instead of being forever tainted by association with corruption. Tom's first instinct was anger, remembering how isolated he'd felt when the community had turned against him. But Marie reminded him that grace was what separated good people from powerful ones, and that holding grudges made you hard in ways that diminished you. So Tom agreed to meet with the guides, and he listened to their stories of economic pressure and divided loyalties, and he recognized his own younger self in their struggles. He offered to help them establish ethical guiding practices and to connect them with conservation groups that needed local expertise. And slowly, a new culture began to emerge on the river, guides competing not just on who caught the most fish, but on who did the most to protect the resource. Tom also reached out to Daniel Pritchard, not to gloat but to understand. They met at a coffee shop in Soldona, two middle-aged men who'd taken different paths through the same moral landscape. Pritchard looked broken, his confidence shattered, facing financial ruin from legal fees and the loss of his pension, and Tom found himself feeling something close to pity. "Why did you do it?" Tom asked, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. Pritchard was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee before he answered. "I convinced myself it was pragmatic," he said finally. "That environmental protection and economic development didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that we could have both if we just negotiated in good faith. And somewhere along the way, I started believing the people writing the checks instead of the people like you who were showing me the evidence. I wanted to be important, to be respected by powerful people, and I lost track of why I went into public service in the first place." He looked at Tom's pinned sleeve. "I'm sorry, that doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't change what happened to you, but I am genuinely sorry." Tom nodded, accepting the apology not because it fixed anything, but because Pritchard's remorse seemed real, and real remorse was where change began. He told Pritchard about the consulting work he was doing, about opportunities for people with regulatory expertise to work on the right side of these fights, and he saw something flicker in the older man's eyes that might have been hope. The second anniversary of Tom's bear attack fell on a September day much like the first, cold and clear, with autumn coming on fast. Tom stood on the bank of the Russian River, watching the salmon spawn in water that ran clean and clear, and he thought about everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. His arm was still gone, the phantom pain still woke him some nights, but he'd made peace with the loss as part of the price you paid for standing up when standing up mattered. The river looked different to him now, not just as a place to make a living, but as a living system that deserved protection for its own sake. And he understood that his grandfather's lessons about reading water had really been lessons about reading responsibility. Sarah came and stood beside him, his daughter, who'd inherited his stubbornness and his commitment to wild places, and she took his remaining hand in hers and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. They watched the salmon together, watched the eagles circling, watched the bears feeding at a respectful distance, and Tom felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The true meaning of strength, Tom had learned, wasn't about physical prowess or refusal to back down. It was about knowing when to fight and how to fight and why fighting mattered in the first place. It was about building alliances and documenting evidence and speaking truth even when truth was inconvenient for powerful people. It was about surviving losses that should have broken you and finding ways to continue being useful to the world. Bradford Remington III had been stronger than Tom in every conventional sense. Wealthier and better connected and protected by systems that served his interests. But Remington had been weak where it counted, willing to destroy irreplaceable things for replaceable money. Unable to imagine that a one-armed fisherman from Kenai might matter more than profit margins. The justice Tom received wasn't perfect, would never restore what was lost, but it was real, and it was precedent, and it meant the next fight might be a little easier for the next Tom Halstead, who decided that protecting what mattered was worth the cost. Tom went back to work the next Monday, arriving at the Fish and Game office in Soldotna with his laptop and his coffee, and his determination to make systems work the way they were supposed to work. He spent the morning reviewing permit applications with the careful attention of someone who understood that paperwork could be life or death for salmon runs and bear habitat. He called Rebecca Chen to discuss testimony for an upcoming legislative hearing on strengthening environmental review processes. He had lunch with Frank and Danny and Pete, the old river guides who'd stood by him when standing by him cost them business, and they talked about the season that was ending and the season that would come, and the slow work of teaching people to value what they couldn't put a price tag on. In the afternoon, Tom gave a presentation to high school students about environmental advocacy, and he told them about the Tidewater fight not as a hero story, but as a cautionary tale about how much easier it was to destroy than to protect, how corruption flourished when good people decided fighting was someone else's job. He showed them his pinned sleeve and told them the truth, that doing the right thing often costs more than you wanted to pay, but that the alternative was waking up one day in a world where everything wild and irreplaceable had been sold off and paved over, and the only stories left were about what used to exist before we traded it for temporary comfort. The students asked Tom what advice he had for them, what they should do if they saw injustice or corruption or destruction. Tom thought about his grandfather teaching him to read the river, about Marie's unwavering faith, about Sarah's courage and Michael's service, and Jeffrey Cardwell hitting a bear with an oar to save a stranger's life. He thought about Rebecca Chen risking her reputation to take on a case everyone said was unwinnable, about Dr. Park giving him the evidence that broke the case open, about Trooper Miller warning him to watch his back, about Judge Rodriguez having the courage to call corruption by its name. You bear witness, Tom said. You document what you see, and you speak truth, even when truth is unpopular, and you find allies because nobody wins these fights alone. You understand that powerful people will try to crush you, and that the cost of resistance is real and sometimes terrible, but you also understand that surrender means teaching the next generation that might makes right, and that ordinary people should just accept whatever the wealthy decide to do to them and their home, and that's not the world any of us should be willing to live in. Tom drove home that evening as the sun set over the inlet, painting the water red and gold, and he thought about making dinner with Marie and calling Sarah to check on her grad school applications, and maybe watching the Seahawks game if Michael wanted to come over. He thought about the routine pleasures of a life lived carefully, about how survival meant more than just staying alive, but required finding ways to be happy despite everything you'd lost. His arm ached the way it always did when the weather changed, phantom signals from nerves that no longer connected to anything. But Tom had learned to interpret the pain as proof that he'd survived something that should have killed him, that he'd faced down power and corruption and prevailed through nothing more complicated than stubborn determination and refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable. The brown bear that had taken his arm wasn't his enemy, was just another victim of human decisions that disrupted systems older than civilization. The real predators were men like Bradford Remington III and Cynthia Voss and Daniel Pritchard, who'd sold their integrity for advancement and hadn't cared about the costs their choices imposed on others. And those predators had been stopped, not permanently, but long enough to matter, not through violence, but through evidence and law, and the courage of people who refused to be silent. What would you have done in Tom's position when speaking up meant risking everything you'd worked for, when protecting wild places meant making yourself a target for powerful people who didn't like being told no? It's easy to say we'd all be heroes, that we'd fight the good fight regardless of cost, but the truth is more complicated and more human than that. Most people have families to protect and mortgages to pay, and legitimate reasons to avoid conflict with those who could destroy them. Tom Halstead wasn't special or superhuman. He was a fisherman who knew his river and couldn't stomach watching it be destroyed, who got mad and stayed mad and channeled that anger into action. He made mistakes and suffered losses and spent nights wondering if he was being selfish for putting his family through hell for the sake of salmon he'd never see spawn and bears he'd never watch feed. But he also understood something that powerful people always forget, that their power is limited and temporary, while wild places, if you protect them, last forever. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people can still win when they refuse to quit, that corruption can be exposed and stopped, that the cost of doing right is high, but the cost of doing nothing is higher. Honor comes not from being strong enough to never lose, but from being brave enough to fight for what matters, even when losing is likely. Tom Halstead lost an arm, but he kept his integrity, and in the end, that was the only trade worth making. The steel jaws clamped shut with a sound like breaking bone, but it wasn't an animal's leg trapped in those cruel teeth this time. Marcus Thornton, heir to the Thornton timber fortune, screamed as the antique bear trap, the very one his grandfather had donated to the museum after it was removed from Elias Hartman's trapline, now held his expensive hiking boot in its grip. Blood seeped through the leather as he clawed at the frozen ground, his breath coming in panicked clouds in the mountain air. His designer flannel shirt, purchased for twice what most families in Coldwater earned in a month, was torn and dirty. The irony was exquisite. The trap had been set here, in this exact spot, as evidence in the wrongful death lawsuit that had destroyed an innocent family. Now that same trap, repositioned with meticulous care, had found new prey. Marcus looked up to see shadows emerging from the tree line, faces he recognized from town, from the sawmill, from the families his father had evicted when their logging contracts were terminated. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know was that every cruel decision, every bribe, every falsified report, every piece of evidence they'd manufactured to steal land and destroy lives had been carefully documented, witnessed, and preserved by the very people they dismissed as ignorant mountain folk. Subscribe now to witness how a community of the powerless became an unstoppable force when honor and truth united against wealth and corruption. But let's rewind to where it all began, to a cold November morning in 1958, when an old trapper made his final walk into the Montana wilderness. The sun hadn't yet touched the peaks of the Bitterroot Range when 16-year-old Daniel Hartman woke to his mother's sobbing. The sound came through the thin walls of their cabin like a wounded animal, raw and terrible. He pulled on his wool pants and flannel shirt, both patched at the elbows, both handed down from his father before the cancer took him 3 years earlier. His younger sister Emma sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, her small hands gripping a chipped mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. Their mother stood at the window, staring out at the frost-covered meadow that separated their property from the dense forest beyond. Sheriff Dawson's patrol car was parked in the yard, its presence as ominous as a hearse. Daniel knew before anyone spoke his grandfather was dead. Elias Hartman, 66 years old, had spent 50 years walking the trap lines that threaded through these mountains. He knew every game trail, every stream, every place where the wilderness showed its teeth. He'd survived blizzards, close calls with mountain lions, and more than one encounter with bears who'd learned to respect the old man's territory. But yesterday, he hadn't come home. Search parties had gone out at first light, and they'd found him 3 hours ago near his northern trap line, his body torn apart by a grizzly bear, his face frozen in an expression of surprise rather than fear. Daniel walked outside despite his mother calling after him. The November air bit his lungs. Sheriff Dawson was a heavy man going soft in middle age, his uniform straining at the buttons, his face carrying that practiced expression of sympathy that lawmen develop for delivering bad news. Beside him stood Owen Marsh, the forest ranger, tall and weathered, his eyes genuinely sad. Owen had known Elias for 30 years, had learned tracking from him, had drunk whiskey with him around countless campfires. He wouldn't meet Daniel's eyes now. The sheriff cleared his throat. They found him near trap number 47, he said. Looks like a grizzly got caught in the trap, freed itself, and attacked when Elias came to check the line. The ranger's report would say death by animal attack. Accidental, no negligence. These things happened in the wilderness. Occupational hazard for a trapper. Daniel's grandfather had taught him to read sign, to understand what the forest told you if you paid attention. He taught him that every track, every broken branch, every scattered leaf told a story if you knew how to listen. And right now, standing in the frozen yard, while the adults delivered their sanitized version of events, Daniel felt something wrong in the story they were telling. His grandfather never set bear traps. He ran trap lines for marten, fox, and beaver. The steel-jawed leg-hold traps he used were sized for animals that wouldn't snap a man's wrist, let alone hold a grizzly. But he didn't say this, not yet. He was the scholarship student at Coldwater High, the poor kid with the dead father and the trapper grandfather. He'd learned to be quiet, to observe, to think before speaking. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small white church that served Coldwater's population of 800 souls. Daniel wore his only suit, too short in the arms now, his wrists jutting out like he was still growing into himself. He probably was. His mother had sewn a black armband on the sleeve. Emma sat beside him, 13 years old, and trying not to cry, trying to be strong like their grandfather had taught them. The church was full. Elias Hartman had been a fixture in this community, one of the old-timers who remembered when Coldwater was nothing but a logging camp and a general store. He'd been fair in his dealings, kind to children, and tough as weathered leather. People respected that, but Daniel noticed who wasn't there. The Thornton family owned half of Coldwater, including the sawmill that employed most of the town. Marcus Thornton Sr. sat in the back row. his presence a calculated show of respect that didn't extend to actually eulogizing the dead. His son, Marcus Jr., 17 years old and already carrying himself like he owned the world, wasn't there at all. Neither was Sheriff Dawson, though that might have been professional rather than personal. The service was simple. Pastor Williams spoke about dust and ashes and the circle of life. Owen Marsh stood and told a story about Elias, teaching him to read bear scat to determine diet and territory. A few of the old trappers shared memories. No one mentioned the grizzly. No one mentioned the torn body. No one questioned the official story. Daniel sat in the front pew and felt rage building in his chest like a slow fire, the kind his grandfather used to build in the wood stove, the kind that burned hot and steady and lasted all night. After the burial, people came to their cabin bringing food, casseroles and pies and soups, the currency of mountain sympathy. Daniel's mother accepted them with quiet dignity, her face drawn and pale. She'd lost her husband to lung cancer, and now her father-in-law to what everyone was calling a tragic accident. 2 men in 3 years. Daniel watched her age a decade in those 3 days. That night, after Emma went to bed, and his mother finally stopped moving, stopped cleaning, stopped trying to fill the silence with activity, Daniel pulled on his grandfather's old coat and walked out into the November darkness. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by. He knew where he was going. His grandfather's traplines were his now, by inheritance and necessity. The pelts from a good season could pay for his mother's medicine, keep food on the table, maybe even help with Emma's school clothes. But more than that, he needed to see Trap 47 for himself. He needed to read the sign that the sheriff and the ranger had either missed or chosen to ignore. The walk took him 2 hours, moving carefully through the forest by moonlight, following trails he'd walked since he was old enough to keep up with his grandfather. The old man had been teaching him the trade, preparing him for the day when the lines would pass to the next generation. That day had come sooner than either of them expected. Trap 47 was on the northern edge of the territory, near the boundary with federal forest land, where Elias's private trapline met the vast wilderness beyond. Daniel found the spot easily. The snow had been trampled by searchers, but enough remained undisturbed that he could read what happened. The trap itself was gone, taken as evidence, but the stake it had been anchored to remained, driven deep into frozen ground. Daniel knelt beside it, his breath steaming in the cold air, and ran his fingers over the disturbed earth. This was wrong. The stake was bent, twisted with tremendous force. But the bend was wrong. A bear pulling against a trap would bend it in line with the pull, would wrench it upward or outward. This stake was bent sideways, torqued at an angle that suggested something had struck it deliberately. Daniel looked around the area. The blood patterns told a story too. His grandfather's blood, dark on snow and frozen earth, showed where he'd fallen. But there was another pattern, a drag mark leading away toward the thick brush. Bears sometimes drag their kills, but the mark here was shallow, wrong. And then he saw it, caught on a low branch 30 feet from the attack site. Fluttering slightly in the night breeze was a scrap of fabric. Not the heavy wool his grandfather wore. This was different, expensive. Daniel plucked it from the branch and held it up to the moonlight. Navy blue, synthetic, the kind of material used in expensive outdoor gear. There were letters embroidered on it, partial, torn, but readable. THO. Daniel pocketed the fabric and continued his examination. The more he looked, the more questions arose. The supposed grizzly tracks were there, massive paw prints in the disturbed snow, but they started abruptly about 50 yards from the attack site, as if the bear had materialized from thin air. Real tracks would show a trail, a path of movement. These just appeared. Someone had made these tracks after the fact, probably using a preserved bear paw, pressing it into the snow to create evidence. His grandfather had shown him how poachers sometimes did this to throw off rangers. It was crude work, obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. But the sheriff and the ranger hadn't looked closely, or they'd been told not to. Daniel felt the rage building again, but he forced it down. His grandfather had taught him that anger was a tool, useful only when controlled and directed. Rage made you sloppy. Discipline made you dangerous. He walked a wider circle around the site, reading the ground like a book. 4 sets of human footprints, maybe 5, all wearing boots, a lot of disturbance, signs of a struggle. And then he found it, half buried in leaf litter under a pine tree, a silver pocket flask, engraved with initials, MT. Marcus Thornton. Daniel didn't touch it. He marked the location in his mind, took note of everything around it, and then he did something his grandfather had taught him for hunting. not for investigating his own grandfather's murder. He backtracked carefully, memorizing every detail, and then he left the forest exactly as he'd found it, carrying only the scrap of fabric and his growing certainty that Elias Hartman hadn't died in an accident at all. Coldwater High School sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, a 2-story brick building that had been new in 1920 and hadn't improved since. Daniel attended on a scholarship program that the state had implemented to encourage rural education. Without it, he'd be working at the sawmill already, dropping out at 16 like most boys from families like his. Instead, he sat in classrooms with kids like Marcus Thornton Jr., whose father owned the sawmill and half the private timberland in the county. Marcus was everything Daniel wasn't: tall, athletic, handsome in that clean-cut way that came from good nutrition and expensive dentists. He played football, drove a new Chevrolet Bel Air, and dated Kelly Morrison, the prettiest girl in their class. His clothes came from catalogs, his hair was always perfect, and he moved through the school like a prince touring his kingdom. He had 3 friends who orbited him like moons: Brett Carlson, whose father was the county judge; Tommy Reeves, whose uncle owned the local newspaper; and Dave Hollister, the sheriff's nephew. Together, they formed an untouchable core of privilege and protection. They weren't just bullies, they were the system itself, concentrated into 4 teenage boys who knew they'd never face real consequences. Daniel had been on their radar since freshman year, marked as different by his scholarship status and his second-hand clothes. They tested him early, small cruelties designed to establish hierarchy, knocking books from his hands, shoulder checks in hallways, casual insults delivered with smiles. Daniel had absorbed it all with the same stoic endurance his grandfather had taught him. Fighting back would mean expulsion, and expulsion meant losing the scholarship, which meant the end of any hope for a different life. So he'd endured, kept his head down, maintained perfect grades, and stayed invisible as much as possible. But now, his grandfather was dead, and Daniel was carrying evidence that suggested Marcus Thornton's family might be involved. Now, invisibility felt like complicity. The first morning back at school after the funeral, Daniel walked through the main doors and felt every eye on him. Small towns process tragedy as public spectacle. Everyone knew about Elias Hartman's death. Everyone had an opinion. Most of those opinions came with sympathy, but sympathy was cheap and useless. Daniel made it to his locker without incident, but he felt Marcus watching him from across the hallway. The look wasn't sympathetic. It was calculating, measuring, like a predator assessing prey for new weaknesses. At lunch, Daniel sat with the other scholarship students and working class kids, a segregated table that no one acknowledged, but everyone understood. Tommy Chen, whose parents ran the Chinese restaurant; Maria Gonzalez, whose father worked at the sawmill; and Jake Peterson, a junior whose family ran a small dairy farm, barely staying solvent. They were his people, united by economic circumstance and social exclusion. Tommy offered condolences. Daniel accepted them. They ate in silence for a while, the cafeteria noise washing over them. Then Marcus's table erupted in laughter, loud and performative. Daniel glanced over and saw Marcus holding court, gesturing animatedly, while his friends laughed. Kelly Morrison sat beside him, beautiful and complicit, laughing at jokes Daniel couldn't hear but could imagine. Brett Carlson was doing an impression of something, walking hunched over, making clawing gestures. It took Daniel a moment to realize he was imitating a bear, imitating how Elias Hartman had died. The other tables noticed. The laughter spread. Some people looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Authority worked like that in Coldwater. The Thorntons had power, and power granted permission. Daniel felt his hands tighten on his lunch tray, felt that controlled rage his grandfather had taught him about. But he didn't move. Not yet. Discipline, observation, timing. These were the lessons that kept trappers alive in the wilderness. And they'd keep Daniel alive in this other kind of wilderness, too. After school, Daniel walked home the long way, through town instead of cutting through the woods. He needed to think. His mother didn't know about his midnight investigation of the trapline. She didn't need that burden. She was struggling enough, trying to figure out how they'd survive without Elias's income from pelts and the odd jobs he did around town. Daniel's after-school job at Anderson's Hardware helped, but it wasn't enough. They'd need the traplines productive, but more than that, Daniel needed to understand what had really happened. The fabric scrap and the flask were evidence, But evidence of what? An accident? A fight that escalated? Or something worse? He stopped by the newspaper office, a storefront operation where Tommy Reeves's uncle published the Coldwater Gazette twice weekly. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Roy Reeves looked up from his typewriter, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his shirt sleeves rolled up. Despite the November chill that seeped through the building's poor insulation, Roy was in his 40s, a transplant from somewhere back east. A real newspaperman who'd ended up in this small town for reasons he never explained. He knew Daniel from around town, knew his grandfather. His expression was genuinely sympathetic. Daniel asked if he could see the file on his grandfather's death. Roy hesitated, then pulled it. There wasn't much. A brief article reporting the death, a quote from Sheriff Dawson about the tragic nature of wilderness accidents, a mention of the funeral. Nothing controversial, nothing that questioned the official narrative. But Roy's hesitation had been real. Daniel thanked him and turned to leave, then stopped. He asked about the Thornton Timber Company, about recent land acquisitions, about federal contracts. Roy's eyes sharpened. "That's a different kind of question," he said. "Why are you asking?" Daniel didn't answer directly. He just said his grandfather had mentioned something before he died, about pressure to sell his trapline territory. It was a lie, but a useful one. Roy studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "The Thorntons have been buying up every parcel they can get," he said, "consolidating. Federal contracts for logging are lucrative, but you need large, contiguous territory to make them work. Your grandfather's land was right in the middle of a potential federal tract. It would have been worth a lot to connect the Thornton holdings." Daniel felt pieces clicking into place. He thanked Roy again and left, his mind working through implications. That evening, sitting at their small kitchen table while his mother mended Emma's school dress by lamplight, Daniel spread out a map his grandfather had marked with the trapline boundaries. The property the Hartmans owned was small, 60 acres of rough mountain land that Elias's father had claimed in the 1890s, but its location was strategic, sitting between two large parcels of Thornton timberland and blocking easy access to a federal forest tract that was about to open for logging contracts. If the Hartmans sold, the Thorntons would have uninterrupted access to thousands of acres of valuable timber. But Elias had refused to sell. Daniel remembered conversations he'd half heard. His grandfather on the porch with men in suits, his voice calm but firm. This land stays in the family. Now Elias was dead, and the land would pass to Daniel's mother, who was barely holding on financially, who might be pressured to sell just to survive. The more Daniel thought about it, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't about a trapping accident. This was about land, money, and the kind of power that came from owning mountains and forests, and determining who worked and who didn't in a town of 800 people who depended on one sawmill for survival. His mother looked up from her mending and saw him studying the map. She asked what he was doing. He told her he was learning the trap lines, that he'd need to run them this winter. She nodded, her face sad but resigned. She didn't know yet that her son was also learning something else, how to hunt human predators instead of animal ones. The next incident came on Friday after school. Daniel was walking to his job at Anderson's Hardware when a car pulled up beside him. Marcus Thornton's Chevrolet, cherry red with chrome that caught the afternoon sun. The passenger window rolled down, and Brett Carlson leaned out, grinning. They offered Daniel a ride. It wasn't an offer. It was a command disguised as friendliness, a show of power. Daniel kept walking. Marcus gunned the engine, and the car lurched forward, cutting him off. All four of them got out. This was a public street, 3 blocks from the sheriff's office, in broad daylight. They weren't hiding. That was the point. Marcus walked up to Daniel, stopping just inside his personal space, using his height advantage. He said he'd heard Daniel was asking questions about his grandfather's death, about land deals. He said that was disrespectful to the investigation, that the sheriff had closed the case, that it was time to let it go and grieve properly. His tone was sympathetic, reasonable, the same tone his father probably used when explaining to workers why their jobs were being eliminated. Daniel didn't respond. He tried to step around Marcus, but Brett and Tommy moved to block him. Dave Hollister stayed by the car, watching the street. A few people passed by, saw what was happening, and walked faster. No one intervened. That's when Marcus dropped the pretense. He grabbed Daniel's shirt and pushed him back against a brick wall. His face was close, his breath smelling of peppermint gum. He said Daniel needed to understand how things worked in Coldwater. The Thorntons kept this town running. They decided who worked and who didn't. They decided who succeeded and who struggled. and right now, they were being patient with the Hartman family, giving them time to grieve. But that patience wasn't infinite. Eventually, Daniel's mother would need to make smart decisions about her future. Selling that worthless mountain property would be smart. Marcus suggested Daniel encourage her to take the generous offer his father would make, for her own good. Daniel's training kicked in, the discipline his grandfather had instilled. He didn't fight, he didn't threaten, he just looked Marcus in the eye and said nothing. Silence could be a weapon too. It unnerved people who expected fear or anger. Marcus held the stare for a moment, then smiled and stepped back. He smoothed Daniel's shirt collar in a gesture of mock friendliness. "Good talk," he said. "I'm glad we understand each other." They got back in the car and drove off, leaving Daniel against the wall, his heart pounding, his mind clear. He was late for work. Mr. Anderson, who'd known his grandfather and understood mountain justice, saw Daniel's disheveled appearance and asked what happened. Daniel said he tripped. Mr. Anderson didn't believe him, but he didn't push. He just nodded and put Daniel to work stocking shelves, physical labor that helped burn off the adrenaline. That evening, Daniel walked home through the woods, his usual shortcut, and stopped at a small clearing where his grandfather had taught him to shoot. The rifle was old, a Winchester lever action that Elias had used for deer hunting, now locked in a case under Daniel's bed. He wouldn't need it, probably, but knowing it was there, knowing he could use it if circumstances demanded, was its own kind of comfort. His grandfather had been a Marine in World War I, had fought in France, had learned that violence was sometimes necessary, but never the first choice. Discipline meant knowing when to fight and when to wait, when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Daniel was learning patience. He was learning to watch and wait while gathering evidence, building understanding. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about truth and consequences delivered with inevitability rather than rage. Thanksgiving came 2 weeks after the funeral. The Hartman family observed it quietly, just the three of them around a table that felt too large without Elias. They had a small turkey, bought with money Daniel earned at the hardware store. His mother had made her best effort with side dishes, but the meal felt hollow, performative. Emma tried to maintain cheer, talking about school and friends, but even she couldn't fill the silence their grandfather's absence created. After dinner, while his mother and sister cleaned up, Daniel walked out to the shed where Elias had stored his trapping equipment. The smell hit him first: leather, oil, tobacco, and something else, some combination of scents that was uniquely his grandfather. The traps hung on the wall, organized by size and type. There were the small leg-hold traps for marten and mink, the conibear traps for beaver, the snares for fox. Everything clean, well-maintained, ready for the season, but no bear traps. Daniel searched the entire shed, nothing. His grandfather hadn't owned bear traps. He'd said they were cruel and unnecessary, that a trapper who understood animal behavior never needed traps that caused maximum damage. So where had the trap supposedly involved in his death come from? The official report mentioned it, described it as one of Hartman's traps, but it didn't exist. Daniel sat down on his grandfather's workbench and thought through the implications. Someone had brought a bear trap to that trap line. Someone had staged the scene. Someone had gone to significant effort to make Elias's death look like an accident. That required planning, resources, and knowledge of how to create convincing false evidence. It also required people willing to lie in official reports. Sheriff Dawson had signed off on the accident conclusion. Owen Marsh had provided the Rangers' report confirming it. Both men had reputations to protect, families to feed in a town where the Thorntons controlled employment. How much pressure would it take to convince them to look the other way, or had they been actively involved? Daniel started running the trap lines the week after Thanksgiving. He needed to re-establish his grandfather's territory, check all the sets, maintain the carefully balanced relationship between trapper and wilderness. But he was also looking for more evidence, anything that might have been missed or overlooked. He found Trap 47 cleaned up, all trace of the incident removed. The stake was gone. The ground had been carefully smoothed. Someone had visited this spot after the sheriff's investigation, had sanitized it. That suggested guilt and fear. Daniel checked his grandfather's other traps, following the route Elias had walked for 50 years. Most were undisturbed. A few had caught animals, 3 marten, 2 fox, and a beaver. Daniel harvested them with the quick efficiency his grandfather had taught him, treating the animals with respect, even in death. These pelts would bring money at the trading post in Missoula. Not much, but enough to help. He reset the traps and continued his circuit. At trap 32, he found something interesting: fresh cigarette butts, expensive brands, the kind you couldn't buy in Coldwater's general store. Someone had been watching the trap line, had stood here smoking, had waited for something. Daniel collected the butts and continued. The pattern repeated at 3 more locations. Someone was surveilling the territory, monitoring his movements. That suggested ongoing interest in this land, ongoing pressure to force a sale. The Thorntons hadn't given up. They were just being more careful now, watching and waiting for the right opportunity to apply pressure. December brought snow, and with it the full burden of winter. Daniel balanced school, his job at the hardware store, and running the trap lines. He slept 5 hours a night, got up at 4 in the morning to check traps before school, went straight from classes to work, came home to study and help his mother with Emma. His grades didn't slip. He couldn't afford for them to slip. The scholarship was his escape route, his path to something better than this cycle of survival and poverty. But exhaustion was a weapon too, one his enemies could use against him. Marcus and his friends had backed off the direct confrontations, but they'd escalated to a campaign of small cruelties designed to grind Daniel down. His locker was vandalized twice, crude drawings and insults scratched into the paint. His homework was stolen from his bag during gym class, forcing him to redo it and turn it in late. Someone spread a rumor that his family was diseased, that his grandfather's death was actually from rabies contracted from trapped animals. The rumor was absurd, but effective. Kids avoided him in hallways. Teachers looked at him with suspicion and pity. Kelly Morrison, who'd once been friendly in the neutral way pretty girls were friendly to everyone, now pretended he didn't exist. The isolation was deliberate, a strategy to break him down, to make him desperate enough to convince his mother to sell. What Marcus didn't understand was that isolation was Daniel's natural state. He'd been alone most of his life, comfortable in the wilderness, comfortable with silence. Their social warfare was annoying, but not devastating. What bothered him more was the effect on his mother and Emma. Kids at Emma's school heard things from older siblings. She came home crying twice, asking Daniel if they were really diseased, if Grandpa had died from something they could catch. Each time, Daniel sat with her and explained patiently that it wasn't true, that some people were cruel because they could be, that strength meant ignoring them and living well despite them. She believed him because he'd never lied to her, but he hated that she had to learn these lessons at 13. Hated that the Thorntons' cruelty extended even to a child who'd done nothing but lose her grandfather. Christmas approached with its usual mountain beauty and economic hardship. The Hartmans couldn't afford decorations or presents, but they had each other and the small warmth of their cabin against the brutal cold. Daniel had saved money from his job and from selling pelts, planning to buy Emma a new winter coat, and his mother a decent pair of boots. Small things, practical things, but they mattered. On December 23rd, he went to Coldwater's only department store to make his purchases. The store was decorated with tinsel and lights, playing carols on the radio, full of families buying last-minute gifts. Daniel found what he needed quickly, brought it to the counter, and reached for his wallet. It wasn't there. He checked all his pockets. Nothing. He'd had it when he left work. He checked it specifically, counted the money, felt the weight of it. Now, it was gone. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, looked at him with that particular expression of pity mixed with suspicion that poor people learned to recognize. He explained he must have dropped it, asked if he could come back tomorrow. She agreed, reluctant but sympathetic. Daniel walked out of the store and saw Marcus and his friends across the street, leaning against Marcus's car, watching him. Brett was holding something up, waving it slightly, Daniel's wallet. They'd pickpocketed him, probably during the crowded hallway change between classes. It was a sophisticated escalation, requiring skill and timing. Daniel walked toward them, knowing it was a trap but unable to walk away. They wanted him to react, to lose control, to give them an excuse. Marcus smiled as he approached. "Looking for this?" he asked, holding the wallet just out of reach. Daniel stayed calm. He asked for it back. Marcus opened it, counted the money inside. $43. Not much, but everything Daniel had saved. Marcus made a show of considering, then pocketed the money and tossed the empty wallet at Daniel's feet. "Consider it a down payment," he said, "for all the trouble your family is causing. You know what would solve this problem? Your mom selling that worthless land to my father. Then everyone could move on." Daniel picked up the empty wallet. He looked at each of them in turn, memorizing faces, filing away this moment. Then he walked away. Behind him, he heard them laughing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't understand, was that every action they took was evidence. Every cruelty was documented in his mind, with the same precision he used for reading animal tracks. And eventually, that evidence would matter. Christmas Day was quiet and sad. Daniel gave his mother and Emma the gifts he'd bought with money borrowed from Mr. Anderson, who'd heard about the theft and had quietly pressed cash into Daniel's hand, with instructions to pay it back whenever he could. They sat around their small tree, a pine sapling Daniel had cut from their own property, and opened modest presents. His mother had knitted him a scarf. Emma had drawn him a picture of the mountains. They were gifts of love rather than money, and they meant more than anything the Thorntons could buy. But the day was shadowed by absence, and by the knowledge that their struggle was far from over. The next day, a man in an expensive suit knocked on their door. He was a lawyer from Missoula, representing Thornton Timber. He had papers and offered to purchase the Hartman property. The sum was insulting, $5,000 for 60 acres of mountain land that was worth 10 times that. Land that would give the Thorntons access to federal contracts worth millions. Daniel's mother listened to the pitch, her face carefully neutral. The lawyer emphasized how difficult it would be to maintain the property, how dangerous the trap lines were. Look what happened to her father-in-law, how the money could give her family a fresh start somewhere else. When he finished, she thanked him politely and told him she needed time to consider. The lawyer left his card and the papers, saying the offer was good for 30 days. After he left, Daniel's mother sat at the kitchen table and cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears of exhaustion and despair. She asked Daniel what they should do. He told her they should keep the land. It was their inheritance, their grandfather's legacy, their only real asset. She nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Fear of poverty, fear of retaliation, fear of making the wrong choice for her children. Daniel understood that fear. It was a weapon the powerful used against people like them, a constant pressure that ground you down until surrender seemed like the only sensible option. The new year came with brutal cold. January 1959 brought temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there, the kind of cold that killed the unprepared and made survival itself an accomplishment. Daniel continued his routine: school, work, trap lines. The pelts were good this year, thick and valuable. He'd saved almost $200 by mid-January, enough to breathe slightly easier, enough to feel like maybe they'd make it through the winter. Then the sawmill where Maria Gonzalez's father worked had an accident. A cable snapped, an impossible failure because the cables were inspected weekly and replaced at the first sign of wear. But this one snapped, and Juan Gonzalez was in the wrong place when it did. The cable caught him across the chest and threw him 15 feet into a pile of cut logs. He died instantly. The sawmill was owned by Thornton Timber. The official investigation found equipment failure, but no negligence. Juan's widow received a small settlement and condolences. She also received eviction notice from their company-owned house, giving her 30 days to vacate. Maria stopped coming to school. Her family moved away, back to family in Texas. One more family broken by the machinery of power and profit. Daniel went to the funeral and saw the pattern clearly. The Thorntons didn't just use direct confrontation. They used the systems they controlled, employment, housing, legal structures, to eliminate obstacles and punish resistance. Juan Gonzalez's death might have been an accident, or it might have been a message. There was no way to prove anything, and that was precisely the point. Fear worked better when it was ambiguous, when every bad thing that happened could be either chance or punishment, keeping everyone off balance and compliant. The next attack on Daniel was more direct and more dangerous. It happened in late January, after a basketball game where Coldwater played a rival school. Daniel hadn't attended, he was running trampolines, but he heard about it the next day. Marcus's team had won, and there'd been a party afterward at the Thornton house. Parents away, liquor flowing, the usual teenage celebration. What Daniel didn't know, until it was too late, was that someone at that party had suggested they needed to teach the Hartman kid a real lesson, that subtle pressure wasn't working, that maybe a more direct approach was needed. They found him on his way home from checking the northern trap line, a route that took him through forest and then along an old logging road for the last mile into town. It was dusk, that dangerous time when light faded and shadows grew, when a person was most vulnerable. Daniel heard the car engine before he saw it, heard the too fast approach on the rough road. He stepped to the side, into the tree line, instinct warning him. Marcus's Chevrolet came around the bend doing 50 miles an hour, far too fast for the conditions. Daniel pressed himself against a tree trunk as the car swerved toward him, tires churning snow and dirt, missing him by inches. He caught a glimpse of faces, Marcus driving, Brett and Tommy laughing, Dave in the back seat looking uncertain. The car fishtailed, recovered, and sped away, its taillights disappearing into the gathering dark. Daniel stood there shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump of near death. They'd tried to kill him, not scare him, not hurt him, kill him, and if they'd succeeded, it would have been another tragic accident. A boy struck by a car, on a dangerous road at dusk, no witnesses. Tragic, but unavoidable. Daniel walked home slowly, his mind working through implications. The escalation was accelerating. They'd moved from social pressure to theft to attempted murder in the space of 2 months. That suggested desperation, which suggested the land deal was time-sensitive. The federal logging contracts must have a deadline, some cutoff date when Thornton Timber either needed to secure contiguous territory or lose the opportunity. That made them predictable. Desperate people made mistakes. Daniel just needed to survive long enough to use those mistakes against them. He started carrying his grandfather's rifle when he ran the trap lines, kept it loaded and ready. He varied his routes and timing, making himself unpredictable. He told Mr. Anderson what had happened, and Anderson, who'd been a Marine in World War II and understood violence and honor, made sure Daniel was never alone, walking to or from work. Owen Marsh, the forest ranger, stopped by the cabin one evening and talked with Daniel on the porch, while his mother was inside with Emma. Owen's face was troubled, guilty. He said he needed Daniel to understand that some situations were complicated, that sometimes people made compromises they weren't proud of, that loyalty and survival created difficult choices. Daniel listened without responding, letting the silence draw out Owen's confession. The ranger admitted he'd been pressured to sign off on the accident report, that Sheriff Dawson had assured him it was accurate, that the Thorntons had made it clear there would be consequences for excessive scrutiny. He didn't know for certain that Elias's death was anything but an accident, but he had his suspicions. He'd seen the Thorntons operate before, seen how they eliminated obstacles. He was ashamed of his complicity, but he had a family, had a job he couldn't afford to lose. He was telling Daniel this because he believed the boy deserved the truth, deserved to know that at least one adult in this corrupt system felt guilty. It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel thanked him. He didn't absolve Owen of responsibility, didn't offer forgiveness, but he recognized the courage it took to admit complicity. After Owen left, Daniel sat on the porch in the January cold and thought about systems of power, about how corruption worked through compromise, about how good people became complicit through fear and necessity. His grandfather had fought in a war where the enemies were clear, where evil wore uniforms and justice was theoretically simple. This was a different kind of war, one fought with legal paperwork and accidents and economic pressure, one where the weapons were poverty and fear and the grinding weight of systems designed to protect the powerful. But wars could still be won with discipline, intelligence, and patience. Daniel just needed to outlast his enemies and gather enough evidence to expose them. February brought a thaw, then more snow, then bitter cold again. The weather reflected the back-and-forth struggle between the Hartmans and the Thorntons, between resistance and pressure, between survival and surrender. Daniel's mother received 3 more visits from the lawyer, each time with adjusted offers, each time with more insistence that the smart choice was to sell and move on. She stood firm, but Daniel could see the toll it was taking. She'd aged years and months, her face drawn, her hands shaking when she thought no one was looking. Emma had nightmares, waking up crying about bears and dead grandfathers, and being forced from their home. The family was fracturing under pressure, and the Thorntons knew it. What they didn't know was that Daniel was building his own case, gathering his own evidence. He'd taken the fabric scrap and the flask to Roy Reeves at the newspaper office, explained what he'd found and what he suspected. Roy had listened, his journalist instincts engaged, but he'd also been realistic about what they could prove. Physical evidence linking Marcus to the scene wasn't enough without witnesses, without official support, without someone in authority willing to investigate. The sheriff wouldn't help. The ranger had already admitted his complicity. Judge Carlson, Brett's father, certainly wouldn't authorize any action against the Thorntons. They needed something bigger, something undeniable, something public enough that it couldn't be buried by local corruption. Roy suggested they needed to document everything, create a record that could be used later when the opportunity presented itself. He started keeping copies of every interaction, every threat, every incident in a file at the newspaper office. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The break came from an unexpected source. Dave Hollister, the sheriff's nephew, started showing up at Anderson's Hardware when Daniel was working. He'd browse the aisles, not buying anything, clearly working up the courage to say something. Finally, in mid-February, he approached Daniel while Mr. Anderson was in the back. Dave looked miserable, guilty, younger than his 17 years. He said he needed to talk about what happened to Daniel's grandfather. He said he'd been there that night, up at the trapline, but he hadn't known what was going to happen. He thought they were just going to scare Elias, convince him to sell. But Marcus had brought the bear trap, had set the scene, had told his friends they needed to eliminate the problem permanently. Brett and Tommy had gone along with it, caught up in the moment and in Marcus's charisma. Dave had frozen, had watched from the trees as Marcus confronted Elias, as the old man had refused to be intimidated, as things had escalated. He'd watched Marcus attack Elias with a tree branch, watched the old man go down, watched them stage the scene to look like a bear attack. He'd watched murder, and he'd been too cowardly to stop it or report it. Now, he was being eaten alive by guilt, having nightmares, unable to sleep or eat. He needed to confess, needed absolution, needed Daniel to tell him there was a way to make this right. Daniel listened to this confession with the same careful attention he gave to reading animal tracks. His heart was pounding, rage and grief warring with the discipline his grandfather had instilled. Dave was offering him the key to justice, but Daniel needed to handle this carefully. He asked Dave if he'd testify. Dave said he wanted to, but he was terrified. His uncle was the sheriff. Brett's father was the judge. Marcus's family owned the town. If he came forward, his life would be destroyed. Unless there was a way to do it safely, unless there was a way to protect himself and still tell the truth. Daniel told him to go home, to act normal, to give him time to figure out a plan. Dave left looking slightly less miserable, as if confession alone had lifted some weight. Daniel immediately went to Roy Reeves and told him everything. Roy's eyes lit up with the story, with the possibility of exposing corruption and getting justice for a murdered old man. But he was also realistic. Dave's testimony alone wouldn't be enough. They needed corroborating evidence. They needed a way to force an investigation that couldn't be controlled by local authorities. They needed to go over the sheriff's head, over the local judge's head, to state or even federal authorities. That would require building an unimpeachable case, which would take time and care. Roy started making phone calls to contacts in Missoula, to the state attorney general's office, to FBI field agents who handled corruption cases. He was careful, discreet, but he was building a network of support outside Coldwater's corrupted systems. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his careful documentation of every threat, every incident, every piece of evidence. He photographed the flask, the fabric, and Dave's written statement detailing what he'd witnessed. He created a timeline of events, connecting the land deal pressure to the murder to the ongoing harassment. He built a case with the same patience and precision he used for setting trap lines, understanding that justice, like hunting, required preparation and timing. March brought the first hints of spring, snow melting in patches, streams running high with runoff, the forest coming back to life. Daniel felt his own life reaching a critical point, a convergence of circumstances that would either break him or provide the opening he needed. The Thorntons increased pressure one final time, this time targeting Emma. She was walking home from school when a car pulled up beside her, Marcus and his friends inside. They didn't touch her, didn't even speak to her directly. They just drove slowly beside her for 3 blocks, making her terrified, making it clear that she was vulnerable, that they could reach her anytime they wanted. Emma ran home crying, told her mother what happened. Daniel's mother finally broke. She said they were selling the land, that she couldn't live with the fear anymore, that no piece of property was worth her children's safety. Daniel understood her perspective, but he also knew that selling wouldn't end this. The Thorntons needed to eliminate loose ends, needed to ensure no one ever questioned Elias's death, needed to guarantee silence. Selling would just make them more vulnerable, more isolated, more likely to be the victims of another accident that cleaned up the whole situation. He convinced his mother to wait one more week, told her he was close to a solution, asked her to trust him. She agreed, reluctant and terrified, 1 week before they accepted the offer and left Coldwater forever. Daniel had 7 days to deliver justice. He went to Owen Marsh and told him everything. Dave's confession, the evidence he'd gathered, the plan forming with Roy Reeves to bring in state authorities. He asked Owen to do the right thing, to provide an official statement acknowledging the irregularities in the original investigation, to be willing to testify if needed. Owen was torn. His face showed the internal battle between self-preservation and honor, between fear and disgust at his own complicity. Finally, he agreed. He said he'd write a supplemental report detailing concerns about the original finding, noting evidence that had been overlooked, recommending a more thorough investigation. It would probably cost him his job, but he couldn't live with himself otherwise. Sometimes doing the right thing required sacrifice, and he'd been a coward long enough. With Owen's agreement, Daniel had testimony from a forest ranger casting doubt on the official report, physical evidence linking Marcus to the scene, and a witness willing to describe murder. But he still needed a trigger, something to force the case into the open where local corruption couldn't bury it. That trigger came from Marcus himself, from his arrogance and his certainty that he was untouchable. On March 15th, there was another party at the Thornton house. Marcus was celebrating his 18th birthday, legal adulthood, the transition to full-fledged heir to the family fortune. He invited the whole school, wanting an audience for his triumph. Daniel obviously wasn't invited, but he heard about it the next day from everyone who attended. Marcus had gotten drunk and talkative, had bragged about eliminating problems, about taking care of business, about how certain obstacles had been removed permanently. He told the story of confronting a stubborn old trapper who wouldn't sell, about teaching him a permanent lesson, about how the wilderness was dangerous for people who didn't know their place. Kelly Morrison, his girlfriend, had been horrified. She'd realized he was confessing to murder. She'd left the party, and after a sleepless night, had gone to her father, who was one of the few independent businessmen in Coldwater, someone who didn't work for Thornton Timber and didn't owe them loyalty. Kelly's father had called the state police. Things moved quickly after that. State investigators arrived in Coldwater within 48 hours, bypassing Sheriff Dawson entirely and setting up operations in the county courthouse. They interviewed Kelly Morrison, who provided a detailed account of Marcus's drunken confession. They interviewed Dave Hollister, who confirmed the details and provided his own eyewitness testimony. They interviewed Owen Marsh, who presented his supplemental report and acknowledged the inadequacy of the original investigation. They interviewed Roy Reeves, who provided the documented timeline of threats and harassment. And they interviewed Daniel, who presented physical evidence and detailed every interaction with Marcus and his friends since his grandfather's death. The case built rapidly, each piece fitting with others, creating an undeniable picture of murder, corruption, and systematic abuse of power. Marcus was arrested on March 20th, charged with second-degree murder. Sheriff Dawson was suspended pending investigation into official misconduct. Judge Carlson recused himself from all proceedings involving his son Brett, who was charged as an accomplice. Tommy Reeves, whose uncle had ultimately chosen journalism ethics over family loyalty, was charged as an accessory. The structure of protection and privilege that had seemed impenetrable collapsed with shocking speed once outside authorities became involved, once local corruption lost its ability to control the narrative. The trial took place in early May, moved to Missoula on a change of venue motion after it became clear Marcus couldn't get a fair trial in Coldwater, where everyone knew the story. Daniel attended every day, sitting in the courtroom with his mother and Emma, watching the machinery of justice grind slowly but inexorably toward accountability. The prosecution presented its case methodically, Dave's testimony about what he witnessed, Kelly's testimony about Marcus's confession, Owen's testimony about irregularities in the investigation, physical evidence linking Marcus to the scene, The defense tried to paint it as a tragic misunderstanding, an accident that had been misinterpreted, boys being boys in a situation that got out of hand. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bear trap had been purchased by Thornton Timber from a supplier in Spokane. Records showed Marcus had signed for it, ostensibly for use in protecting timber equipment from bears. But it had ended up at Elias Hartman's trapline instead, used to stage a murder scene. The flask with Marcus's initials had been found exactly where Daniel said it was, confirmed by investigators who'd returned to the scene. The fabric scrap matched a jacket Marcus was known to own, photographs from school yearbooks showing him wearing it. Most damningly, 3 witnesses described him confessing to murder, describing details that matched the evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all charges: second-degree murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering. Marcus Thornton was sentenced to 20 years in state prison. Brett Carlson received 10 years. Tommy Reeves received 5. Dave Hollister, who testified for the prosecution and shown genuine remorse, received 2 years suspended sentence and probation. Judge Carlson was disbarred for his attempts to interfere with the investigation. Sheriff Dawson resigned and faced his own charges for official misconduct. Marcus Thornton Sr.'s role couldn't be proven directly, but the investigation revealed a pattern of corrupt business practices that resulted in federal charges for fraud and bribery. Thornton Timber collapsed, its assets seized, its operations shuttered. The sawmill was eventually sold to a workers' cooperative that established fair practices and safety protocols. The day the verdict came down, Daniel stood outside the courthouse in Missoula and felt something release in his chest. Not joy exactly, because his grandfather was still dead, because justice couldn't restore what had been taken, but satisfaction, the deep satisfaction of knowing that evil had consequences, that corruption could be exposed, that the powerful could be held accountable. His mother cried, not from sadness this time, but from relief. Emma hugged him and said their grandfather would be proud. Owen Marsh, who'd lost his job as a forest ranger but had found work with a conservation organization that valued his integrity, shook Daniel's hand and said, "Sometimes doing the right thing cost everything you had, but returned something more valuable, the ability to look yourself in the mirror." Roy Reeves published a comprehensive account of the entire affair in the Coldwater Gazette, a story that was picked up by newspapers across Montana and eventually won him a state journalism award. The article detailed not just the murder, but the systemic corruption that had enabled it, the way power and money had created a culture where crimes went unpunished as long as they served the right interests. It became a case study in rural corruption and the importance of accountability. For Daniel, the months after the trial were strange. He was still in high school, still needed to finish his education, but he was no longer invisible, no longer just another poor scholarship student grinding through each day. People knew his name now. Teachers treated him with respect. Students who'd once avoided him now wanted to be friends, drawn to his notoriety and to the moral authority his struggle had granted him. He found it exhausting and hollow. Most of them hadn't helped when it mattered, had looked away while he was being harassed and his family terrorized. Their friendship now felt opportunistic, self-serving. He remained closest to the people who'd supported him from the beginning. Mr. Anderson, who'd given him a job and steady employment. Tommy Chen, and the other scholarship students who understood what it meant to survive on the margins. Roy Reeves, who'd risked his reputation and his family relationships to pursue truth. These were his people, bound by shared experience and mutual respect rather than social convenience. He graduated that June as valedictorian, his scholarship securing him admission to the University of Montana, where he planned to study forestry and land management. He wanted to understand the systems that governed wilderness, the laws and policies that determined how public land was used, the balance between conservation and commerce. His grandfather's death had taught him that land was worth fighting for, that wilderness had value beyond timber contracts and profit margins. He wanted to spend his life protecting it. The Hartman property stayed in the family. Without pressure from the Thorntons, they were able to manage it sustainably. Daniel running trap lines during winter breaks and summers, slowly building a nest egg that helped support his education and his mother's more stable life. Emma thrived, with the weight of fear removed, became an excellent student herself. talked about becoming a teacher someday. Their mother slowly recovered from the trauma, the lines in her face softening, her hands steadying, her future no longer consumed by existential dread. They visited Elias's grave together every month, brought flowers in summer and evergreen boughs in winter, stood in the mountain cemetery, and told him what was happening in their lives. Daniel always imagined his grandfather listening, approving, his stern face softened by the knowledge that his family had survived, that justice had been served, that the lessons he'd taught about honor and discipline had taken root. Some wounds never fully healed. Daniel still woke sometimes from dreams of his grandfather being attacked, still felt rage when he thought about how close the Thorntons had come to destroying his family. But those feelings coexisted with pride, with satisfaction, with the knowledge that he'd done what needed to be done, that he'd used intelligence rather than violence, patience rather than rage, system-level thinking rather than individual revenge. His grandfather had taught him to be a hunter, to understand patterns and behavior, to wait for the right moment to act. Daniel had applied those lessons to human predators instead of animal ones, and it had worked. Justice had been served not through vigilantism, but through careful documentation, strategic alliances, and faith that truth would ultimately matter to someone in authority. Years later, when Daniel was a forest ranger himself, working in the Bitterroot Wilderness, he'd sometimes think about that winter of 1958-1959, about the crucible that had forged him, about the lessons learned through grief and struggle. He'd think about Marcus Thornton in prison, about whether incarceration had changed him or hardened him, about whether redemption was possible for someone who'd killed out of greed and arrogance rather than passion or necessity. He'd think about Dave Hollister, who'd found the courage to testify and had gone on to become a social worker helping at-risk youth, as if atoning for his cowardice by spending his life preventing other kids from making his mistakes. He'd think about the systems of power that protected the wealthy and punished the poor, about how little had fundamentally changed despite his personal victory. But he'd also think about the individuals who'd made different choices, who'd stood up when it mattered. Owen Marsh choosing integrity over job security, Roy Reeves choosing truth over family peace, Kelly Morrison choosing morality over social status, Mr. Anderson quietly providing support without asking for recognition. These people proved that corruption wasn't inevitable, that ordinary people could resist, that honor and courage still mattered, even when the systems were rigged against them. And he'd think about his grandfather Elias, about the quiet dignity of a man who'd worked hard, treated people fairly, and raised a family according to principles that seemed old-fashioned but proved timeless. Honesty, courage, loyalty, and the understanding that strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them. That was the real legacy, more valuable than land or money, more enduring than any material inheritance. Daniel carried those principles into his own life, applied them in his work protecting wilderness, passed them to his own children when they came along. The cycle continued, each generation learning that justice required vigilance, that power had to be checked by accountability, that ordinary people willing to stand up for what was right could sometimes defeat systems designed to protect the privileged. So what's the moral of this story? What should you take away from this account of murder, corruption, and eventual justice in a small Montana town? First, understand that bullying isn't just schoolyard cruelty. It's a manifestation of power imbalances that exist at every level of society. The Thorntons could bully because they controlled resources others needed. Employment, housing, legal systems. They'd built a structure where resistance seemed futile and compliance seemed smart. Breaking that structure required someone willing to endure, to document, to wait for the right opportunity rather than reacting emotionally. Second, recognize that justice isn't automatic. The wheels of justice don't grind on their own. They require people willing to push them, often at personal cost. Owen Marsh lost his job. Dave Hollister lost his family relationships. Roy Reeves damaged his reputation in his own family. Kelly Morrison faced social ostracism. Each of them paid a price for choosing truth over convenience, but together they created momentum that corrupt local authorities couldn't stop. Third, understand that accountability is possible even when systems are rigged. The Thorntons seemed untouchable because they controlled local power structures. But those structures existed within larger systems: state and federal authorities, independent journalists, legal frameworks that applied even to the privileged. Finding ways to invoke those larger systems, to appeal to authorities outside corrupted local control, was the key to breaking the cycle. Fourth, remember that violence and revenge aren't the same as justice. Daniel could have killed Marcus Thornton. He had the skills, the opportunity, and the motivation. But that would have made him a murderer himself, would have allowed the Thorntons to paint his family as dangerous criminals, would have solved nothing. Instead, he chose the harder path: documentation, patience, strategic alliance building, faith in justice systems to eventually work. That choice preserved his integrity and created lasting consequences for his enemies rather than temporary satisfaction. Finally, recognize that the fight isn't over when justice is served in one case. The structures that enabled the Thorntons' abuses still exist in countless communities, protecting wealth and punishing resistance, creating conditions where corruption flourishes. Real change requires constant vigilance, institutions that check power, individuals willing to resist, and communities that support truth-tellers rather than punishing them. Every time someone stands up to a bully, whether that bully wears expensive clothes, or carries a badge, or signs paychecks, they're participating in the ongoing work of creating a more just society. It's exhausting, often thankless, sometimes dangerous, but it's necessary, because the alternative is submission, silence, and the gradual erosion of everything that makes civilization worth preserving. What would you have done in Daniel's situation? Would you have fought back, fled, or found another way? Comment below and share this story with anyone who needs to hear that justice is possible, even against overwhelming odds, that ordinary people can triumph over corrupt systems, that honor and integrity still matter in a world that often rewards their opposites. Subscribe to hear more stories about the triumph of truth over power, about individuals who refuse to be broken by systems designed to crush them, about the enduring human capacity for courage in the face of corruption. The expensive hiking boots skidded on wet leaves as Bradley Ashford stumbled backward, his designer jacket catching on branches. And for the first time in his entitled life, he understood what real fear tasted like: metallic and sharp, flooding his mouth as the massive black shape moved through the underbrush toward him with deliberate hunger. His father's connections couldn't save him here. His mother's lawyer couldn't negotiate with a predator that had been pushed past the edge of desperation by men exactly like him. The moonbear's eyes caught the dying light filtering through the cedar trees, and Bradley's expensive smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers, the screen cracking against a rock, the last text message to his followers frozen mid-send. Found the old man's grandson LOL going to teach him about Japan. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know was that every cruel act leaves a trail, every victim remembers, and nature itself keeps accounts that eventually come due in blood and terror. Subscribe now to witness how karma hunts those who hunt the innocent, how the wilderness becomes both judge and executioner, how privilege melts like snow in spring when true consequences finally arrive. But let's rewind to where it all began. 3 months earlier, on a morning when the rice fields still stretched peaceful and golden under an autumn sky that promised nothing but honest work and quiet dignity. Kenji Tanaka woke at 4:30 every morning, same as he had since childhood, same as his grandfather before him, rising in the darkness to begin the day's work with the discipline his American mother had taught him and the honor his Japanese father had embodied, until cancer took him 6 years ago. The scholarship to Hokkaido Agricultural College was pinned to his wall above the low table where he studied each night, a reminder that his grades and his determination were the only path out of the cycle of poverty that had claimed 3 generations of his family. He moved quietly through the small wooden house that had been his grandfather's, careful not to wake the old man, whose breathing came labored and uneven from the back room, whose 71 years of farming rice in these northern fields had bent his spine and weathered his hands into gnarled tools themselves. Kenji pulled on his work clothes, faded and patched but clean, and stepped into the cold morning air that smelled of earth and coming winter. The village of Nishiokop clung to the edge of the wilderness, a collection of aging farmhouses and families who remembered when bears stayed in the mountains and didn't come down hungry and desperate into human spaces. Now the forests were shrinking, logged by companies from Tokyo who cared nothing for the balance between humans and wildlife, and the bears came looking for food with increasing boldness, their traditional feeding grounds replaced by luxury ski resorts and vacation homes for people who would never understand what it meant to work land that had sustained your bloodline for centuries. Kenji found his grandfather already in the fields despite the doctor's orders, moving slowly between the rows of harvested rice stalks, checking for any remaining grain before the first snow arrived. Old Tanaka-san looked up when his grandson approached, and his weathered face crinkled into a smile that still held the strength of a man who had survived occupation, poverty, and the slow death of rural Japanese tradition. "You should be sleeping, Oji-san," Kenji said, taking the worn basket from his grandfather's hands. The old man waved him off with the stubbornness that ran in their family, like the dark current of the river that fed their fields. "Sleep when I'm dead, boy. Still got work before winter comes." They moved through the rows together as dawn broke pink and gold over the Kitami Mountains, grandfather teaching grandson the 100 small lessons that couldn't be learned from books: how to read the soil, how to predict weather from the behavior of birds, how to honor the land that fed you, even when that land gave you nothing but calluses and an aching back. "College will take you away," the old man said without accusation, just stating fact the way farmers do. "That's good, make something better than this." But Kenji loved this: the smell of earth, the rhythm of seasons, the connection to something older than economics and ambition. He just wanted to do it right, with modern techniques and sustainable practices. Wanted to prove that traditional farming could survive in the new Japan if you were smart enough and worked hard enough. His grandfather squeezed his shoulder with surprising strength. "Your father would be proud. Your mother, too. Even though she went back to America, you got her brains and his honor. That's a good combination." They worked until the school bus horn sounded from the road, and Kenji jogged back to grab his bag, washing quickly at the outdoor spout, changing into his school uniform that marked him immediately as different from the wealthy kids whose parents owned resort companies and development firms. The bus ride to Hokkaido Agricultural College took 40 minutes through mountain roads that twisted past clear-cut hillsides and half-finished construction projects, signs of the development boom that was transforming northern Hokkaido from farmland and wilderness into something else entirely. Kenji sat in his usual spot near the front, earbuds in, but no music playing, just a barrier against the social dynamics that made every school day a navigation of careful silence and strategic invisibility. He reviewed notes for the agronomy exam scheduled for next week, memorizing soil composition tables and nutrient cycles, aware without looking that Bradley Ashford and his crew occupied the back of the bus like lords surveying their domain. Bradley's father owned Ashford Development Corporation, the company responsible for most of the new ski resorts and vacation home complexes spreading through the region like a rash. Bradley himself was enrolled in the agricultural program purely for show, a requirement from his father, who wanted the appearance of the family caring about local tradition, while they systematically destroyed it. He was 20 years old to Kenji's 18, had repeated a year after partying his way through failure, and carried himself with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. His mother was American, connected to political families back in the States, which gave Bradley this weird hybrid identity he leveraged into social power. Too international to be constrained by Japanese courtesy, too wealthy to care about anyone's opinion anyway. His crew included 3 other rich kids: Marcus Chen, whose family owned hotel chains, Dmitry Kozlov, whose father ran timber operations, and Yuki Nakamura, whose politician mother had made rural development her signature issue while taking donations from every corporation that wanted to pave over rice fields. Kenji had learned to read the morning's threat level by the volume of their laughter and the particular edge of their conversation. Today sounded bad. He kept his eyes on his notes, but tracked their movement in his peripheral vision, old instincts from 3 years of navigating their attention. "Hey, scholarship boy," Bradley's voice carried over the bus engine noise. American accented English designed to exclude the Japanese students, and the driver who pretended not to understand. "You hear about the bear attack last night. Big black bear took down someone's grandfather near here. Bet the old guy was trespassing on development land. Got what he deserved for not understanding progress." Marcus laughed too loud. the sound of someone who had never been funny, earning praise through proximity to power. Kenji's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around, didn't take the bait, just kept his eyes on nitrogen fixation rates and crop rotation patterns, while his heart rate elevated and his breathing stayed carefully controlled the way his mother had taught him during her last visit. When she'd noticed the bruises and the careful way he moved through social spaces, she'd wanted him to come back to California with her, but he couldn't leave his grandfather, couldn't abandon the land his family had worked for generations, just because some privileged asshole made school uncomfortable. No reaction, she'd said, gripping his hands across the table in their small kitchen. Men like that feed on reaction. You be smarter, better, stronger in the ways that actually matter. You survive, you succeed, and you let their own karma catch them eventually. Her own father had been military, had taught her about picking battles and maintaining discipline under pressure. Lessons she'd tried to pass on to her half-Japanese son, who sometimes felt caught between two cultures and fully accepted by neither. The school sat at the base of the mountains, modern buildings funded by agricultural companies who wanted their names on research facilities and their influence in curriculum decisions. Kenji navigated the morning routine with the precision of someone who had mapped every safe route and calculated every risk. Locker between classes, bathroom only during instruction time when halls were empty, lunch eaten quickly in the library where his friend Hana Suzuki worked as an assistant. Hana was the daughter of a veterinarian, one of the few students whose family lived modestly, despite having education and options, and she had appointed herself his ally against Bradley's crew with the fierce loyalty of someone who recognized injustice and refused to accept it as normal. "He's spreading rumors again," she told him during a lunch, sliding printouts of social media posts across the table, while Kenji ate the rice balls his grandfather had prepared before dawn. "Says your family are squatters on land his father's company legally acquired. Says your grandfather is senile and dangerous. That you're only here because of diversity quotas." Kenji studied the posts without reacting, noting the pattern of escalation, the way Bradley was building a narrative that could justify future actions. This was how powerful people operated. They constructed stories where they were heroes or victims, never aggressors, so when they struck the final blow, it seemed justified, or even merciful. "Let him talk," Kenji said, though each word felt like swallowing glass. "Words don't change facts. My grandfather's land title goes back to before the war. My scholarship is merit-based, top scores in entrance exams. Bradley's the one who bought his way in." Hana leaned forward, her voice dropping. "My father says there's been 3 bear attacks in 2 weeks. The animals are starving because logging companies destroyed their feeding grounds. The construction is driving them into farmland, looking for food. People are going to die if something doesn't change." That afternoon, in wildlife management class, Professor Nakamura, no relation to Yuki Nakamura, lectured about human-wildlife conflict and habitat fragmentation, while Bradley texted openly in the back row, his expensive phone never confiscated, his behavior never corrected, because his family's donations funded half the department's research. The pattern had been establishing itself over 3 years, since Kenji first arrived as a scholarship freshman, and Bradley decided that someone should be made to understand their place. It started small, textbooks going missing, lockers vandalized, whispers and exclusion, and the 1,000 tiny cuts of social hierarchy. Kenji had endured it with the stoic determination his grandfather modeled, believing that success would be the best revenge, that graduating top of his class and getting into graduate school would be vindication enough. But Bradley's campaign had escalated in recent months, growing bolder as he sensed his time at the college ending without having broken his chosen target. Frustrated that Kenji refused to quit, or retaliate, or give him the satisfaction of visible suffering. Last month, Bradley's crew had cornered him after late lab work, surrounded him in the parking lot, while Bradley delivered a speech about how people like Kenji were parasites on society, how his family were backwards obstacles to progress, how he should drop out and stop wasting resources meant for students who actually belonged. Kenji had stood silent through it all, hands at his sides, meeting Bradley's eyes without aggression or submission, just existing in that space with a calm that clearly enraged the bully more than fighting back would have. Marcus had shoved him then, hard enough to send him stumbling against a car, and Kenji had simply steadied himself and walked away while they laughed at what they interpreted as cowardice, but was actually discipline, control, the ability to choose when and how to engage, that his mother had drilled into him alongside the basics of self-defense she learned from her Army Ranger father. Never fight unless it's necessary, she told him during that last visit, demonstrating basic strikes and holds in their small yard, while his grandfather watched with approval. But if it becomes necessary, you fight to end it completely. No half measures, no matching their level. You go straight to making it impossible for them to continue. Then you walk away and let the authorities handle the aftermath. Winter came early that year, snow dusting the mountains in late October. While the valleys still showed autumn gold, the bear sightings increased, desperate animals driven from their hibernation preparations by lack of food, wandering into villages and farms with a boldness that terrified the elderly residents who remembered when such things didn't happen. When bears and humans maintained respectful distance, Kenji's grandfather began carrying an air horn in the fields, and Kenji joined him each dawn to help with the last preparations before hard winter, watching for signs of wildlife intrusion, while the old man inspected irrigation systems and equipment storage. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, broken by occasional instruction, the old man teaching him to read the land the way you'd read a book, every detail meaningful for those who knew the language. On the morning of November 7th, Kenji's grandfather sent him to town early for supplies, wanting his grandson focused on school rather than farm work. Kenji argued, but obeyed as always, taking the bus that left at 6:30. Arriving at school 2 hours before first class to study in the library, while the building slowly filled with students. He was deep into soil chemistry notes when Hana found him, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Kenji, there's been an attack. A bear killed a farmer this morning in Nishiokopa." The world seemed to tilt sideways, sound becoming muffled, his vision tunneling to Hana's face as she gripped his arm. "They don't have identification yet. Emergency services just arrived. But Kenji, it's near your grandfather's property." He was running before conscious thought, phone pressed to his ear while his grandfather's number rang endlessly, backpack abandoned on the library table, while Hana called after him about waiting for more information, about not assuming the worst. But Kenji knew, with the cold certainty that sometimes arrives ahead of confirmation, knew from the fact that his grandfather wasn't answering, knew from the timing and location, and the way this felt like the universe finally demanding payment for their family's accumulated suffering. The police officer who met him at the village entrance had the worn compassion of someone who had delivered too much bad news in a rural area where everyone knew everyone. "I'm sorry, son. We need you to identify the body." His grandfather had been attacked in the east field, the one farthest from the house, where he'd been working alone in the dawn light. The Asiatic black bear had been massive, driven by starvation to overcome its natural fear of humans, and the attack had been swift and brutal. They'd shot the bear an hour later when it refused to leave the area, finding it skeletal under its winter coat, weighing barely half what it should have with ribs showing and desperation in its behavior. The wildlife officers explained about habitat loss and food scarcity, about logging operations destroying berry patches and salmon streams, about how they'd been warning local governments that this would happen, but development interests always won out over conservation concerns. Kenji stood in the field where his grandfather had fallen, blood darkening the soil his family had tended for generations, and felt something fundamental break inside him. Not his resolve, not his honor, but some last vestige of belief that the world operated on fairness, or that quiet dignity was enough protection against cruelty, whether it came from humans or nature, or the intersection of both. His grandfather's body had been removed, but his tools remained scattered where he'd dropped them, the old worn implements of a life spent in service to land and tradition. Kenji gathered them slowly, each one a memory, and when he looked up at the mountains where logging scars showed brown against green, he understood with cold clarity that his grandfather had been murdered just as surely as if someone had pulled a trigger. The bear had been the weapon, but human greed had been the killer. Companies like Ashford Development that clear-cut feeding grounds and built luxury resorts and valued profit over the balance that had sustained this region for millennia. The funeral was attended by the entire village, old farmers and their families who had worked alongside Tanaka-san for decades, who brought food and shared stories and wept openly for one of their own taken before his time. Kenji moved through it in a state of numb functionality, receiving condolences and making arrangements and signing documents that transferred property into his name with the blessing of distant relatives who had long ago moved to cities and had no interest in returning to farm life. Professor Nakamura came, standing apart from the other mourners, waiting until most had left before approaching Kenji with the careful respect of someone delivering information rather than opinion. "Your grandfather filed complaints," he said quietly, showing Kenji photocopies of official documents. 6 times in 2 years, reporting bear sightings on his property, requesting that logging be halted until migration patterns could be assessed. Every complaint was dismissed. The local government official handling environmental reviews is married to Bradley Ashford's aunt. He met Kenji's eyes steadily. This was preventable. People knew it was coming. They chose development money over human lives. Kenji took the documents with hands that didn't shake, filing them away in the careful part of his mind that was already assembling pieces into a larger picture. His mother arrived 2 days later, face drawn with grief for the father-in-law she had loved and respected, bringing with her an intensity of purpose that reminded Kenji where he got his own determination. She held him while he finally broke, sobbing against her shoulder for the grandfather who had raised him, and the injustice that had taken him, and the loneliness of being the last of his line on land that had sustained generations. "We make it mean something," she said, when his tears finally stopped. "We don't let them pretend this was just nature. We hold accountable every single person who chose profit over safety." Bradley Ashford posted on social media 3 days after the funeral, a carefully crafted message expressing sympathy for the family's loss, while noting that farming near wilderness areas carried inherent risks, that traditional land use practices might need to evolve to accommodate modern safety standards, that perhaps this tragedy demonstrated the wisdom of planned development that created clear boundaries between human and wildlife spaces. The subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. If Kenji's grandfather had sold his land to Ashford Development, like the smart people had done, he'd still be alive in a city apartment somewhere collecting a pension. Kenji read the post in the school library, where he'd returned after the funeral, his mother having flown back to California with promises to return and support him however needed, but ultimately unable to abandon her own life indefinitely. Hana watched his face as he scrolled through the comments, most of them from students agreeing with Bradley's assessment. A few brave souls pushing back only to be shouted down by accounts that all seemed to coordinate their responses suspiciously well. "He's building a narrative," Hana said, the veterinarian's daughter, understanding public relations better than most students twice her age, making it seem like your grandfather's death was his own fault for not adapting. Classic blame the victim strategy. Kenji said nothing, just screenshot the entire thread, including Bradley's original post and several particularly cruel responses from his crew, saving them methodically the way he'd been saving evidence for 3 years now. Dates, times, locations, witnesses, building a case without fully understanding what the case might eventually become. That night, he stood in his grandfather's house, now his house, surrounded by the simple belongings of a life well lived, and made a decision. He would finish the semester, maintain his grades, continue his research project on sustainable agriculture and wildlife coexistence. He would document everything, and he would honor his grandfather's memory, not by seeking revenge, but by exposing the systems that had killed him, and forcing changes that might prevent the next preventable tragedy. The harassment intensified after the funeral, as if Bradley interpreted Kenji's grief as weakness, an opportunity to finally break someone he'd been working on for years. The attacks became more coordinated, more public, designed to humiliate and isolate in ways that couldn't be ignored, even by Kenji's practiced stoicism. Someone hacked his school account and changed his research paper due dates, causing him to miss deadlines that threatened his scholarship status. His truck tires were slashed twice in 1 week, forcing him to bike the mountain roads in early winter cold. Social media filled with posts questioning how a scholarship student could afford college after losing family income, implying he was committing fraud or receiving inappropriate assistance. The attacks followed a pattern that Kenji recognized from his mother's stories about workplace harassment, designed to provoke response while maintaining plausible deniability, creating a paper trail that would make him look paranoid or aggressive if he complained, leveraging institutional bias toward wealthy donors who funded programs versus poor students who merely benefited from them. Professor Nakamura noticed and pulled him aside after class, speaking in the careful way of someone who wanted to help but was constrained by politics. Document everything. Keep your grades perfect. Don't retaliate. I'm making my own record, but I'm limited in what I can do, without proof that connects Ashford directly, rather than just suspecting. Kenji thanked him and continued his careful campaign of documentation and endurance, aware that Bradley was growing frustrated by the lack of visible reaction. That frustrated bullies became reckless bullies. That recklessness created evidence. The escalation came in early December during the annual Agricultural Symposium, a showcase where students presented research projects to professors, industry representatives, and potential employers. Kenji had spent months developing a comprehensive analysis of sustainable farming practices that could coexist with wildlife corridors, using his grandfather's land as the case study, proposing buffer zones and conservation easements that would allow development while protecting the ecosystem services that prevented human-wildlife conflict. His presentation was scheduled for the symposium's final slot, the prestige position that indicated faculty confidence in his work. Bradley's presentation was scheduled 2 slots earlier, a mediocre project about resort development and agricultural tourism that his father's company had essentially ghostwritten for him. Kenji arrived early to set up, found his research materials destroyed, laptop smashed, display boards torn apart, 3 months of physical samples and data collection rendered useless. The attack had happened overnight, campus security conveniently showing a gap in footage during the relevant time period. No witnesses, despite the student lounge being accessible to dozens of people. Bradley expressed performative sympathy when he arrived, suggesting loudly that Kenji should have been more careful with valuable materials, that maybe stress from his grandfather's death was affecting his judgment. Kenji stood among the ruins of his work, while faculty members whispered and other students pretended not to see, and felt the last constraints of patience and civility beginning to crack. But he didn't explode, didn't give Bradley the satisfaction. Instead, he requested permission to present from memory and notes, was granted a reduced time slot, and delivered a passionate verbal summary of his research that earned a standing ovation from half the audience and stony silence from the industry representatives whose companies his proposals would have regulated. In the aftermath of the symposium, while faculty debated grade adjustments and discussed investigating the vandalism, Kenji walked the winter campus and realized with cold clarity that the system would never protect him, that documented evidence of harassment meant nothing when his antagonist's family funded buildings and endowed chairs, that he could endure forever and still never be safe because Bradley's type didn't stop until they were stopped. He thought about his mother's self-defense lessons, about her stories of her own father, who had been special forces and had taught her that true strength wasn't about size or aggression, but about will, strategy, and the ability to recognize when talking time was over. He thought about his grandfather, working land that had sustained generations, maintaining balance with nature and tradition, even as modernity threatened both. He thought about Bradley's entitled smirk and the way systems bent around him to accommodate his cruelty. And Kenji made a choice that night to shift from defensive to strategic, to stop merely enduring and start actively working toward the resolution that justice demanded, even if institutions wouldn't provide it. He called his mother and spoke carefully, aware that phone conversations could be monitored, asking questions about her father's military service, and the lessons she'd learned about preparation and documentation. She understood immediately what he wasn't saying, the DNA-level recognition of family steel in her son's voice. "You do nothing illegal," she said firmly. "You don't give them any excuse to make you the villain, but you also don't keep being the victim. There's a space between those extremes where smart people operate. You find that space, and you work from there." They talked for 2 hours, tactical conversations about evidence gathering and strategic patience, about identifying allies and understanding that justice was a long game requiring discipline more than rage. The bear attacks continued through December as starving animals delayed hibernation, searching desperately for any food source before winter fully closed around them. 2 more farmers were injured, both elderly, both hospitalized with serious injuries that would probably end their ability to work their land independently. The local news covered it extensively, but framed it as natural disaster rather than preventable consequence, interviewing Ashford development executives who expressed sympathy, while noting that their planned resort expansion would actually improve safety by creating clear boundaries between human development and wilderness. Bradley shared these news stories on social media with commentary about how traditional farming was becoming untenable, how his generation would be the ones to find pragmatic solutions that older people resisted. Kenji studied these posts with the same careful attention he gave to soil samples, noting patterns in language and timing, building a profile of someone who was escalating in both frequency and boldness. He began carrying a small voice recorder that his mother had sent, documenting conversations and encounters, never mentioning its existence or presence. He asked Hana to help track Bradley's social circle, identifying who were true believers in his narrative versus who were followers who might flip if pressure were applied. He reached out quietly to other students Bradley had targeted over the years, finding a network of victims who had transferred schools or dropped out or simply endured in silence, each one willing to document their experiences if someone was collecting evidence for purposes that might finally matter. And he waited, knowing that Bradley's ego and frustration would eventually push him into action that couldn't be ignored or explained away. That bullies who never face consequences eventually overextend because they forget that rules exist at all. Christmas approached with heavy snow and continued wildlife sightings. The mountains, beautiful and deadly as winter, established its dominance over the northern landscape. Kenji spent the holiday break working his grandfather's land, maintaining equipment and planning spring planting, refusing to consider selling out to development companies whose agents called regularly with offers that increased each week. His mother couldn't visit, but video called daily, checking on his mental state and his tactical preparation, reminding him that he was choosing a hard path that required perfect execution because partial success would only make things worse. "When you move," she said over their evening call on Christmas Eve, "you move with overwhelming evidence that makes their defense impossible. You don't confront until you can prove everything. Not just one incident, but the pattern, the system, the institutional failure. Otherwise, you're just another angry kid who couldn't handle college." Kenji nodded, thinking about his grandfather's patient approach to farming, how you didn't rush seasons or force growth, but worked with natural rhythms, preparing soil and trusting that seeds planted correctly would eventually produce exactly what was needed. On New Year's Day, he received an email from Professor Nakamura with an attached file containing 3 years of incident reports involving Bradley Ashford, each one dismissed or minimized by administration, each one establishing a pattern that any honest review would find damning. The professor's message was brief: "For your records, graduate students have few protections, but faculty can document. Use wisely." Kenji added it to his growing collection of evidence while snow fell outside, and the mountains stood silent, and the ghosts of his ancestors seemed to gather in approval of the accounting that was slowly taking shape. Classes resumed in January, and Bradley returned from holiday break with new energy, posting photos from tropical vacations and ski resorts, while his classmates compared modest family gatherings and part-time work schedules. He seemed emboldened by the passage of time since the symposium vandalism, confident that the incident had been forgotten or attributed to Kenji's own carelessness, ready to continue his campaign of systematic harassment now that they'd entered the final semester before graduation. Kenji had been accepted to graduate school at Hokkaido University, a full scholarship for advanced agricultural research that represented vindication for years of perfect grades despite constant obstruction. Bradley had applied nowhere, content to join his father's company in a position that required no qualifications beyond DNA. The diverging futures should have created natural separation, but instead seemed to make Bradley more determined to ruin what he couldn't claim, to prove that merit meant nothing compared to connections and wealth. The first incident of the new semester came during orientation week, when Bradley's crew cornered Kenji in the equipment storage barn after everyone else had left, surrounding him in the dim light between tractors and harvesting machines. Marcus did most of the talking this time, Bradley hanging back in a way that suggested careful planning, maintaining deniability while his followers executed strategy. "Thing about scholarships," Marcus said, stepping close enough that Kenji could smell expensive cologne mixed with alcohol, "is they can be revoked. Academic integrity violations, behavior issues, whatever. All it takes is the right complaint to the right people." Dimitri moved to block the only exit while Yuki filmed on his phone, creating a record that could be edited into any narrative they wanted. Your grandfather's dead, your land's worthless, your scholarship's temporary, you don't belong here, and everyone knows it. So maybe it's time to quit pretending and let people who actually matter finish their education without looking at your charity case face every day. Kenji stood perfectly still, breathing controlled, hands relaxed at his sides, despite the adrenaline urging him to fight or flee, and he met Marcus's eyes, with the calm his mother had drilled into him during countless practice scenarios. "You done?" he asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise them, the lack of fear or anger disrupting their script. Bradley stepped forward then, needing to assert dominance, pushing Marcus aside to confront Kenji directly. "You think you're tough? You think ignoring us makes you better? Your grandfather died because he was too stupid to adapt. You're too stupid to learn from his mistakes. We could make you disappear and nobody would care." The threat hung in the cold air of the barn, explicit enough to be criminal if properly documented, and Kenji's hand moved to his pocket, where the voice recorder had been running since they'd first surrounded him. "Interesting," he said softly. "Say that last part again." Bradley's eyes narrowed, some instinct finally warning him that he might have overextended, but his ego wouldn't let him back down in front of his crew. "I said we could make you disappear. You think you're special, but you're just another poor kid who should know his place." Kenji nodded slowly, committing every word to memory beyond just the recording, then looked past Bradley to where Hana stood in the doorway with her own phone recording, arrived at exactly the time Kenji had texted her an hour ago after predicting this confrontation based on Bradley's escalating social media posts. "Thanks for the clarity," Kenji said, stepping past them with confidence that suggested he could back it up physically if needed, which he could, though they didn't know about the years of martial arts training his mother's military contacts had provided or the deliberate strength building he'd done through farm work. They let him pass, confused by his lack of fear, and he walked out into winter sunlight, where Hana fell into step beside him. "Got all of it," she confirmed quietly. "Every word, clear audio, faces visible. That's conspiracy to commit assault, maybe more." Kenji nodded, adding the footage to his collection but not yet deploying it, still waiting for the perfect moment when the evidence would be overwhelming and the timing would prevent any defensive counter-narrative. Bradley and his crew seemed to interpret his non-reaction as weakness again, not understanding that strategic patience was its own form of strength, that some battles were won before the first punch was thrown through superior preparation and discipline. The tension escalated through January, as Bradley grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to provoke Kenji into a response that would justify expulsion or arrest. The harassment became more creative and dangerous. Anonymous reports to immigration officials claiming Kenji's mother had overstayed visas decades ago, false tips to campus police about drug possession in his locker, social media posts alleging that Kenji had made violent threats that required investigation. Each incident was documented, disproven, and filed away in Kenji's growing case file, each one establishing malicious pattern rather than isolated pranks. Professor Nakamura began attending to Kenji's defense behind scenes, quietly correcting false reports to administration, providing character witnesses when needed, but also counseling Kenji that his patience couldn't last forever, that eventually the system would fail him because it was designed to protect wealth rather than justice. "You're gathering evidence for what?" the professor asked during one late office meeting. "To what end? The college won't expel the Ashford kid while his family funds the new research center. Local authorities won't prosecute when his father employs half the town. What's your plan beyond documentation?" Kenji showed him the spreadsheet he'd been building. 3 years of incidents, cross-referenced with witnesses, physical evidence, communications records, social media archives, establishing beyond any doubt that Bradley Ashford had engaged in sustained, systematic harassment aimed at forcing Kenji to quit school or retaliate in ways that would destroy his own future. "I'm not building a case for campus justice," Kenji said quietly. "I'm building a case that will survive national scrutiny. When this goes public, it needs to be undeniable. It needs to show institutional failure, law enforcement bias, corruption that allowed a wealthy family to torture someone for years because they could afford the protection." Professor Nakamura studied him with new respect. "You're going to the media, not campus media, but real journalists who investigate this kind of systematic abuse." Kenji nodded. My mother has contacts. She knows people who covered military sexual assault stories, who broke institutional cover-ups. When I graduate, when I have my scholarship and acceptance secured, so they can't retaliate by destroying my future, I'm releasing everything with full documentation, showing how systems failed at every level. Bradley goes to jail or he doesn't, but either way, everyone knows what he did and who protected him. February brought a brutal cold snap that killed 3 more elderly farmers, not through bears, but through exposure when their heating failed, and help came too slowly to remote properties that development companies wanted cleared for resort expansion. The deaths received minimal coverage, rural poverty, and isolation treated as inevitable rather than policy choice, and Kenji added the obituaries to his evidence file under a section labeled Consequences of Prioritizing Development. His academic performance remained perfect despite the ongoing harassment, his research on sustainable agriculture and wildlife coexistence earning recognition from conservation groups and environmental organizations. Several news outlets covering the bear attack crisis contacted him for interviews about his grandfather's death and his proposals for preventing future incidents. And Kenji gave careful, measured responses that documented the link between habitat destruction and human fatalities without yet naming specific companies or individuals. He was building public credibility, establishing himself as expert rather than victim, so when the full story dropped, it would come from someone with authority rather than someone who could be dismissed as bitter or biased. Bradley seemed oblivious to this strategic positioning, still seeing Kenji as the scholarship student he could crush, rather than the documentarian who was methodically building his downfall. The disconnect would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous, Bradley's ego preventing him from recognizing that the game had changed, that Kenji wasn't playing defense anymore, but had shifted to careful offense that would only become visible when it was too late for countermeasures. The final escalation came in early March during the spring equipment maintenance class, a hands-on session where students worked with heavy machinery under supervision of technical instructors. Kenji was assigned to a tractor maintenance station, working methodically through diagnostic procedures, while other students handled different equipment. Bradley's crew was assigned to a nearby station, ostensibly working on harvester mechanics, but primarily focused on their phones and making jokes. Kenji was under the tractor checking hydraulic lines when he heard the engine start above him, felt the machine lurch forward, even though protocol required wheel blocks and the parking brake engaged. He rolled clear instinctively, years of farm work giving him the reflexes to recognize danger and react faster than thought, and watched the tractor roll forward several feet before the instructor screamed and hit the emergency shutoff. The silence that followed was absolute except for Kenji's elevated breathing and the instructor's shouted demands for explanation. The wheel blocks had been removed, the parking brake disengaged, the ignition wired to bypass safety interlocks. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the equipment in a way that would have crushed Kenji if he'd been slower or less aware. The instructor called campus security, while students stood in shocked silence, and Bradley's crew suddenly became very interested in their own equipment, refusing to make eye contact. This wasn't vandalism or harassment anymore. This was attempted murder, and everyone in the room knew it, even if proving who was responsible would be difficult. Campus security treated it as accidental equipment malfunction initially, college administration clearly preferring any explanation that didn't involve investigating wealthy students for serious crimes. But Kenji had expected exactly this response, had prepared for institutional failure, and 3 hours after the incident, his mother's journalist contacts received comprehensive evidence packages containing 3 years of documentation, showing pattern of escalating harassment, copies of dismissed incident reports, video and audio recordings of explicit threats, and now evidence of attempted murder in a context where institutional authority had failed repeatedly to protect a student. The story broke simultaneously across multiple news platforms, regional, national, and several English-language outlets that his mother's American contacts helped coordinate. Headlines read, "Elite students' 3-year harassment campaign culminated in apparent murder attempt while college officials ignored evidence," and Hokkaido Ag College's failure to protect scholarship student raises questions about class bias and institutional corruption. The articles included Kenji's name with his permission, included Bradley Ashford's name because the evidence was strong enough to overcome defamation concerns, and included excerpts from the hundreds of documented incidents showing systematic failure by administration to address clear pattern of criminal behavior. Social media exploded with the story, conservation groups linking it to the bear attacks and rural development issues, class disparity activists framing it as wealth-protecting predators, American outlets picking it up because Bradley's family connections to U.S. politics made it internationally relevant. Within 24 hours, the college was facing investigations from police, education ministry officials, and civil rights organizations, while Bradley and his crew suddenly had lawyers advising them to stop talking to anyone about anything. The investigation moved faster than institutional cover-ups could control once external authorities became involved with media attention, ensuring transparency. Campus security footage that had mysteriously malfunctioned for previous incidents was suddenly recoverable when real police with actual warrant power began asking questions. Students who had remained silent while authority figures might punish them for speaking suddenly found courage when journalists offered platform and protection. The evidence Kenji had gathered over 3 years became the foundation for a criminal investigation that expanded to include not just Bradley's actions, but the institutional failures that had enabled them: administrators who dismissed complaints, security staff who erased footage, faculty who looked away because their positions depended on donor money. Professor Nakamura was vindicated, his own documentation proving he tried repeatedly to force action only to be overruled by superiors, and he became a key witness in what was rapidly becoming a national scandal about wealth, privilege, and the two-tier justice system that protected aggressors while blaming victims. Bradley's father attempted damage control through the usual channels: lawyers, PR firms, donations to strategic organizations, but the story had reached critical mass, where money couldn't suppress it, where too many people cared and too many outlets were competing for details. Ashford Development Corporation's stock price dropped as investors questioned leadership ethics, and several municipalities announced reviews of approved development projects, pending investigation of possible corruption in permitting processes. The legal consequences came in waves through spring and summer as various jurisdictions pursued different charges based on evidence and jurisdiction. Bradley Ashford was arrested on charges of assault, harassment, criminal mischief, and conspiracy, held on substantial bail that his father paid, while his lawyers negotiated plea agreements that prosecution refused because political pressure demanded visible accountability. Marcus Chen, Dmitry Kozlov, and Yuki Nakamura faced similar charges with varying severity based on their documented participation in specific incidents, their lawyers arguing they'd been led by Bradley, which prosecutors accepted in exchange for testimony against the primary aggressor. The campus security officer, who had deleted footage, was charged with obstruction and fired, singing extensively about pressure from administration to protect wealthy students. 2 administrators resigned under threat of termination for cause, losing pensions and facing possible civil liability from Kenji, who had assembled a civil case in addition to criminal proceedings. The Hokkaido prefectural government launched investigation into development permits and environmental reviews, finding extensive evidence of corruption and bribery connecting Ashford Development to local officials, including the official whose wife was Bradley's aunt. The bear attack crisis became national story connecting habitat destruction to human fatalities, leading to new regulations on logging and development near wildlife corridors. Legislation that conservation groups had sought for years suddenly politically viable because an old farmer's death had finally created enough public outrage to overcome industry lobbying. Through all of this, Kenji maintained his studies, finishing his semester with perfect grades and graduating with highest honors despite media attention and legal proceedings and the constant demands of being prosecution's key witness in multiple cases. His mother attended graduation, proud and fierce, and ready to defend him from any remaining threats. Though the campus atmosphere had transformed completely, Bradley's former supporters suddenly invisible, and other students treating Kenji with respect, bordering on reverence. Professor Nakamura gave the commencement speech, speaking carefully about institutional integrity and the courage required to demand accountability from systems designed to protect themselves, never mentioning names, but everyone understanding who he meant. Kenji received his diploma to standing ovation, then stood at podium as student speaker and delivered remarks his grandfather would have approved, calling for honor over expediency, justice over convenience, and the recognition that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. That real power emerged from communities demanding better rather than individuals accepting less. He mentioned his grandfather by name, spoke about the bear attacks and habitat destruction, connected personal tragedy to systematic failures, and called for everyone listening to examine the ways they tolerated injustice because confronting it was uncomfortable or risky. The speech was recorded, went viral within hours, became required viewing in ethics classes and orientation sessions, a 6-minute distillation of the semester's lessons that transcended the specific incident to address fundamental questions about what kind of society people wanted to create through their choices and their silences. Bradley Ashford's trial occurred in late summer after his lawyers exhausted delay tactics, and prosecution demonstrated they had overwhelming evidence, including his own recorded threats and testimony from former friends who had flipped to save themselves. The trial lasted 3 weeks, every day covered by media while Kenji testified with calm precision, answering questions without embellishment or emotion, simply stating facts documented by evidence that defense couldn't refute. Bradley's lawyers tried arguing that he was young and immature, that social pressure and family expectations had created stress that explained his behavior, that wealthy people deserved second chances, same as poor people got public defenders and plea deals. The prosecution countered that wealth had enabled 3 years of escalating abuse, that every protection Bradley received had depended on money and connections, that his targeting of Kenji had been deliberate class warfare designed to drive someone talented from opportunities purely because they challenged his sense of natural superiority. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and the judge's sentencing reflected both legal guidelines and public pressure for accountability. 3 years prison time for the assault-related charges, additional suspended sentences for harassment and conspiracy charges, permanent restraining orders preventing contact with Kenji or any other documented victims, mandatory community service, working with rural development organizations under supervision, and 5 years probation after release, with conditions including anger management and ethics counseling. Bradley's father sat stony-faced through sentencing, his own legal troubles just beginning with investigations into corporate corruption and environmental crimes. Marcus, Dimitri, and Yuki received lighter sentences reflecting their cooperation, suspended prison time, probation, community service, and permanent marks on records that would follow them forever despite their family's wealth and connections. The civil cases proceeded more slowly, but ultimately resulted in significant financial penalties and policy changes that mattered more than money. The college settled with Kenji for an undisclosed amount that his mother's lawyer confirmed was substantial, along with policy reforms requiring mandatory reporting of harassment complaints, third-party investigation of incidents involving donor families, and annual training on class bias and institutional responsibility. Ashford Development Corporation faced environmental lawsuits and permit challenges that stalled their expansion plans and cost them contracts worth billions in aggregate. The Ashford family's political influence crumbling as connections distanced themselves from toxic association. Several municipalities established new regulations on development near wildlife habitat, creating buffer zones and requiring environmental impact assessments that previous industry lobbying had prevented, changes that came too late for Kenji's grandfather, but might save future farmers from similar preventable tragedies. The story of the harassment and the institutional failure that enabled it became case study in ethics courses, training programs for educators and administrators, example of how systems fail when protecting wealth becomes more important than protecting people. Kenji donated most of his settlement to conservation organizations working on wildlife corridor protection and to scholarship funds for rural students pursuing agricultural education, keeping only enough to secure his grandfather's land in permanent trust, ensuring it would never be developed, regardless of financial pressure. Redemption came unexpectedly in the form of a letter Kenji received during his first semester of graduate school, forwarded through his lawyer from Bradley Ashford in prison. The letter was handwritten, several pages of careful script that seemed to represent genuine reflection rather than strategic image management. Bradley wrote about his childhood, his father's pressure to prove superiority over people his family considered inferior, his mother's casual racism and classism absorbed as normal worldview, the way wealth had insulated him from consequences until consequences finally arrived, too massive to buy his way clear. He wrote about therapy in prison, about confronting the reality of what he'd done and the pain he'd caused, about understanding finally that his actions could have killed someone, and that terrorizing Kenji for 3 years had been evil regardless of system failures that had enabled it. He didn't ask for forgiveness, stated explicitly he didn't deserve it, but wanted Kenji to know that the person who had tormented him recognized his own monstrousness and was working to become someone different. The letter ended, "My father taught me that power meant domination and wealth meant immunity. You taught me that real strength is surviving despite people like me, that honor matters more than advantage, and that justice eventually comes even for those who thought themselves untouchable. I destroyed 3 years of your life because I could. You responded by exposing a corrupt system and saving future victims. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the right to be called decent, knowing I might never succeed, but required to try anyway, because you demonstrated that character is choice, not circumstance. Thank you for not becoming what I tried to make you." Kenji read the letter multiple times, shared it with his mother, who recognized genuine contrition from someone finally confronting the consequences of his own choices, and eventually wrote back a brief response, accepting the attempted apology while noting that forgiveness was earned through sustained changed behavior rather than words. They maintained occasional correspondence over the following years, Bradley's letters documenting his work on behalf of prisoners' rights and rural development advocacy, Kenji's brief responses encouraging continued growth while maintaining appropriate distance. It wasn't friendship and never would be, but it was acknowledgement that people could change when forced to face who they'd actually been. Hana Suzuki continued working with conservation organizations, her father's veterinary practice expanding to include wildlife rehabilitation services, funded partly by new government programs for human-wildlife conflict prevention. Professor Nakamura was promoted to department chair after the previous administration was purged, his first actions implementing the reforms he'd advocated for years regarding transparency and student protection. The college established an endowed scholarship in Tanaka-san's name for rural students studying sustainable agriculture. Announcement made with public acknowledgement that institutional failure to protect his grandson from harassment represented failure to honor the values the scholarship supposedly celebrated. Kenji's research on wildlife corridors and sustainable development became the foundation for his graduate thesis, and eventually for new regional planning guidelines adopted across Hokkaido, practical policies that balanced economic needs with ecological sustainability in ways that prevented the habitat destruction that had killed his grandfather. He occasionally gave talks about his experience, carefully framed as examination of how systems fail and how individuals can demand accountability, always emphasizing that his story had ended, as well as it did only because of privilege, education, documentation skills, lawyer mother with media connections, and that countless others suffered similar abuse with no platform or resources for justice. 3 years after his grandfather's death, Kenji stood in the fields that had sustained his family for generations, now protected by conservation easements that would preserve them in perpetuity regardless of development pressure. The bear population had stabilized with new protections for feeding habitat and wildlife corridors, connecting mountains to lowlands in ways that reduced conflict with humans. The scars on the landscape from clear-cut logging were slowly healing, regeneration beginning in areas where new regulations prevented further destruction. The village of Nishikopa remained small and aging, but survived, connected now to networks of sustainable agriculture and ecotourism that valued tradition rather than paving it over. Kenji had declined offers from prestigious research positions to stay in Hokkaido, working land his grandfather had tended while conducting the academic work that would influence policy beyond his immediate region. His mother visited regularly, proud of the son who had honored both sides of his heritage. By combining American assertiveness with Japanese respect for tradition, who had transformed personal tragedy into systematic change without losing himself to bitterness or revenge. On the anniversary of his grandfather's death, Kenji planted trees around the field where the attack had occurred, native species that would restore habitat and provide food for wildlife, living memorial more meaningful than stone markers. Friends and former students joined him, making it community action rather than personal gesture, and Professor Nakamura offered brief remarks about how honoring memory meant preventing future tragedy through wisdom and action rather than just mourning. The story of what had happened at Hokkaido Agricultural College became one of those narratives that circulated in educational circles and social justice communities as example of individual courage, forcing institutional accountability, of documentation and strategic patience overcoming wealth and privilege, of how one person refusing to be silenced could expose corruption that affected entire communities. Kenji generally avoided discussing the personal details, preferring to keep focus on systemic issues rather than individual drama, but occasionally would share his experiences with students or activists who asked how to fight injustice when systems seemed designed to protect aggressors. His advice was consistent: document everything, build unassailable evidence, identify allies, understand that justice is long game, requiring patience and precision. Never seek revenge, but absolutely demand accountability. Remember that institutions resist change until cost of resisting exceeds cost of changing. He emphasized that his story's relatively positive resolution was unusual, that most harassment victims never got justice, and that his access to resources had been crucial, that the goal should be changing systems, so individuals didn't need heroic effort just to survive education or employment. When people asked if he regretted not fighting back physically when Bradley confronted him, Kenji would quote his mother's military training philosophy: "Real victory is forcing your enemy to defeat themselves through their own overreach. That violence usually plays into aggressors' hands, while strategic patience and documentation creates irrefutable cases that courts and public opinion can't ignore." Bradley Ashford was released from prison after serving his full sentence, his good behavior record less impressive than his documented work advocating for educational programs and prisoners' rights reform. He emerged into a world that had moved on from his scandal but hadn't forgotten it. His name permanently associated with the worst kind of entitled cruelty, his family's business diminished by legal troubles and reputation damage. He worked with nonprofit organizations focused on anti-bullying education and institutional accountability. His testimony about how wealth and privilege had enabled his worst impulses becoming uncomfortable but valuable case study for training programs. His relationship with his father remained strained, the older Ashford never quite accepting responsibility for the culture he'd created that had produced a son who thought terrorizing classmates was acceptable. But Bradley's mother had begun her own journey of confronting her own bias and privilege, becoming unexpected advocate for reform. Bradley and Kenji's correspondence continued occasionally, never warm, but representing acknowledgement that people contained capacity for both terrible harm and genuine change. That accountability required recognizing both without excusing either. When asked in interviews whether he'd forgiven the person who had tormented him for years and nearly killed him, Kenji's answer was carefully considered. Forgiveness isn't about absolution, it's about refusing to let someone else's choices continue defining your life. I won't forget what happened, but I won't be limited by it either. He's responsible for becoming better. I'm responsible for using the platform this situation created to prevent similar abuse. Those are separate accountabilities that occasionally intersect, but fundamentally remain individual choices about who we decide to become. What would you have done in Kenji's position, facing years of escalating harassment, while institutions designed to protect students instead protected their wealthy donors? Would you have maintained documentation and strategic patience, or would anger and frustration have pushed you toward confrontation that might have destroyed your own future? The story reminds us that justice often requires playing a longer game than instinct demands, that evidence and patience can overcome advantages of wealth and privilege, but also that such victories depend on resources and skills that not everyone possesses. Subscribe now and share this story if you believe in accountability over privilege. If you understand that real strength comes from discipline and honor rather than domination and cruelty. If you've ever felt that systems protect aggressors while blaming victims, the greatest honor we can give to Tanaka-san's memory and other victims of preventable tragedy is refusing to accept injustice as inevitable, demanding that institutions serve all members of community, not just those who can afford protection, and recognizing that every person who stays silent when witnessing abuse becomes complicit in its continuation. Like and subscribe to support stories about ordinary people demanding accountability from corrupted systems, about how patience and documentation can defeat wealth and connections, about the difference between revenge and justice, about redemption requiring genuine change rather than performative apology. The lesson here transcends individual incident to address fundamental question about what kind of society we build through our choices. Do we tolerate cruelty because confronting it is uncomfortable, or do we demand better even when demanding better puts us at risk? Do we protect wealth and privilege regardless of behavior, or do we enforce standards that apply equally regardless of resources? Do we blame victims for not fighting back hard enough? Or do we question systems that force victims to become their own advocates because authorities won't protect them? Kenji's story demonstrates that honor and integrity eventually defeat corruption and cruelty, but also reminds us that such victories shouldn't require heroic individual effort, that functional societies protect their vulnerable members through institutions rather than expecting each victim to build their own case against their own abusers. Share this story with anyone who needs reminder that justice is possible but not inevitable, that it requires witnesses willing to document truth and systems willing to enforce accountability, that wealth creates advantages but doesn't guarantee immunity when enough people refuse to look away. The bears are no longer starving in the mountains of Hokkaido, wildlife corridors now protected by regulations that came too late for one old farmer, but might save countless future victims. The college has new policies protecting students regardless of family wealth. Bradley Ashford served his time and works toward redemption while living with permanent consequences of his choices. And Kenji Tanaka farms the land his family tended for generations, while conducting research that prevents future tragedies, honoring his grandfather's memory through work that matters more than revenge ever could. That's justice, not perfect, not instant, but real, and earned through courage that refused to become what it fought against. Tom Halstead had been born in a cannery worker's cabin in Kenai in 1957, back when Alaska was still new to statehood, and the smell of salmon guts was as much a part